In the quiet hours before dawn, when the world grows still and the veil of noise withdraws, ancient voices begin to rise again. They speak from dust-covered scrolls and shattered tablets, from fragments carried across deserts and buried beneath forgotten cities. Their words are faint, yet steady, as though guarded by a patient truth that refused to disappear. These voices tell of beings whose shadows once stretched across valleys, whose steps trembled the early earth, whose presence shaped memories too vast for simple records. They tell of giants, creatures born in the tension between heaven's purity and the wandering desires of the watchers. These accounts did not stand in the light of the canon. They lived on the edges instead. They survived in hidden libraries, in monastic margins, in stories whispered by exiles who carried them from one generation to another. Why did these testimonies remain when so many others faded? Why did scribes and elders preserve words that kingdoms tried to forget? Perhaps the earth itself remembered. Perhaps the remnants of a world before the flood demanded witnesses. Or perhaps the ancient writers sensed that these tales carried warnings shaped not only for their own age, but for every age that followed. The survival of these texts is not an accident. It is a quiet answer to a deeper question: what truths refuse to die? In these surviving fragments there is longing, sorrow, judgment, and remembrance. There is the echo of a world undone, yet also the whisper of mercy woven through its collapse. And as each fragment unfolds, the listener is invited into a slow, sacred journey, not toward fear, but toward understanding. A journey that asks softly, what was so important that the past would not let it fade? Let the story open with calm steps. Let the ancient world rise once more. In the earliest ages, before the rise and fall of kingdoms, before the weight of sorrow bent the spirit of humankind, the world rested beneath a great stillness. It was a stillness not of emptiness, but of order. A quiet breath moved across the face of creation, carrying the first memory of light, and the earth answered that breath with peace. Nothing hurried, nothing contended. The foundations of the world held their place, and every boundary stood clear beneath the gaze of the Most High. The ancient texts describe these beginnings with gentle certainty. Genesis speaks of a formless deep shaped by a purposeful hand. Jubilees recalls the ordering of times and seasons, each placed with care so that the earth would know when to waken, when to rest, and when to wait. Wisdom writings echo this harmony, describing creation as a structure built with understanding, each part measured, each part weighed. The early ages were not loud. They unfolded like a slow dawn rising over a quiet field. Above the earth stretched the expanse, a separation drawn with intention. Heaven remained distinct, a realm of clarity and radiance, untouched by the dust that would one day remember sorrow. Earth remained grounded, clothed in soil and seas, prepared to receive breath and life. Between these realms lay a boundary both visible and unseen, a threshold of purpose that none crossed without command. This boundary was not a wall of rejection but a line of wisdom. It preserved harmony. It held the worlds in balance. Set upon this boundary were the watchers of the early times, angels appointed as keepers of order, guardians of what had been spoken into existence. Their presence did not stir fear, it brought assurance. They moved like pillars of calm across the unseen pathways of the heavens, witnessing the unfolding of the world with patient eyes. Some tended the rising light, some guarded the treasury of winds, some walked the borders where spirit touched flesh. All carried the weight of ordained purpose. The earth beneath them responded with obedience. Mountains lifted their heads at the appointed hour. Rivers traced their courses with gentle precision. Seas knew their limits and did not cross them. Forests awakened in their seasons, and the earliest life emerged in quiet harmony, shaped by hands that did not falter. Nothing was out of place, for the order of the Most High rested upon every hill, every stream, every breath of wind. In those days, time itself seemed to flow with a slower rhythm. It was not measured by conflict or loss, but by the steady unfolding of creation's design. The world was young, yet it bore the dignity of ancient purpose. Nothing had yet introduced strain into its harmony. The soil had not tasted blood. The heavens had not echoed with rebellion. The deep had not risen in judgment. All things were aligned beneath a single order, and this order was peace. The early stillness carried a kind of expectation, as though creation waited for footsteps not yet taken. The earth knew its role, to hold life, to nurture it, to witness its growth. The heavens knew their role, to guide, to watch, to keep the balance of the hour. Eoms, the angelic host, moved between these purposes like a quiet breath across the threshold of dawn. They did not seek dominion. They did not reach beyond what was appointed. Their allegiance was firm, and their stations held steady. This was the world before fracture, a world before grief, a world where harmony was not a memory but the foundation of existence itself. Ancient writers preserved this picture not to stir longing for a lost age, but to reveal the intention upon which all creation was built. Order was not an afterthought. It was the first gift. Boundaries were not burdens. They were guardians of life. And in this early silence, the seeds of future ages waited, unmoving, untouched, and unaware of the storm that would one day break upon the world. In the quiet strength of those early ages, creation flowed according to a rhythm that needed no correction. The heavens shone with unbroken clarity, their light descending upon the world like a gentle vow. The earth received that light with gratitude, for every hill and valley had been shaped to reflect the harmony of its maker. Nothing strained against its purpose. Nothing sought to rise above the place it had been given. Each thing lived within the order that sustained it. In this calm balance, the boundaries between the realms remained firm yet graceful. They were not barriers of fear, but thresholds of wisdom, lines drawn to preserve the purity of each domain. The heavens held their brightness, untouched by the dust of mortality. The earth held its promise, prepared to bear life in all its forms, and between them stood the appointed guardians, watching with quiet devotion. These guardians, spoken of in ancient writings as holy watchers, bore the weight of profound responsibility. Their presence was not loud, for their authority required no proclamation. They observed the unfolding of seasons and measured the breadth of creation as it expanded. Their gaze reached across oceans, deserts, and mountains. They witnessed the rise of winds and the settling of early mists. They guarded the threshold where spirit touched matter, ensuring that all things remained aligned with the intention set from the beginning. The watchers did not merely stand guard, they participated in the harmony of the early world. Some maintained the order of the heavens, attending to the paths of stars and keeping the divisions of light. Others tended to the earth's unseen foundations, strengthening the currents beneath its surface and guiding the quiet growth of creation. They understood their roles not as restrictions, but as sacred trusts. Through their obedience, the balance of the realms was preserved. Below them, the earth continued its slow awakening. The soil grew rich with promise. The seas deepened in quiet majesty. Rivers wove soft threads across the land, binding one region to another with effortless grace. Life began to rise from the ground with gentle certainty. Each creature found its place within the order that shaped it. Nothing sought dominance. Nothing sought excess. The world moved with a single, untroubled breath. Humanity, though not yet touched by trial, held a unique place within this harmony. Crafted with intention and placed within a world prepared to receive it, humanity lived in quiet innocence. Ancient texts describe this early state as one of clarity, a time when the mind was not clouded by fear, pride, or confusion. The earth welcomed humanity, and humanity walked softly upon it. The watchers observed this new life with solemn reverence, aware that humanity carried a purpose not yet revealed. In these beginnings, there was no fracture between realms. The heavens did not contend with the earth. The earth did not resist the heavens. The guardians did not question their stations. The The first families of humankind lived near to the original design, guided by a peace that required no instruction. Creation was whole, and its wholeness radiated through every part of existence. The early silence was not empty, it was full. It held the weight of intention, the presence of unseen wisdom, and the quiet anticipation that accompanies all beginnings. The world was like a scroll yet to be written upon, its surface smooth, its message awaiting the slow unfolding of time. The watchers saw this potential and safeguarded it with unwavering patience. Yet within this peace lay the subtle tension that precedes change. Not a tension of conflict, but of destiny. Creation had been set in motion. Humanity had been placed within its care. The watchers held their posts with diligence. But the fragile balance of the realms depended on obedience, on humility, on remaining within the appointed boundaries. For now, all remained steady. The earth knew its role. The heavens held their glory. The watchers stood in quiet devotion. The early world rested before the waters, unaware that the silence would one day break and that the harmony of creation would soon face a test as ancient as time its. The early world moved beneath a calm that seemed endless. Dawn rose without sorrow. Night arrived without fear. The breath of creation flowed in steady rhythm, unbroken and untroubled. This harmony rested not only upon the earth, but upon the heavens themselves. Every realm accepted its purpose, and purpose sustained the peace. High above, the firmament held its appointed place. Its expanse, described in the ancient writings, stretched like a great tapestry dividing the realms. Light moved across its surface with gentle ease. Stars traced quiet paths through its depths, each one set within boundaries older than memory. Their courses did not waver. Their radiance did not fail. They shone according to the command that shaped them. Beneath this celestial order, angels continued their silent watch. Their presence bridged what was visible and unseen. They guarded the threshold between the realms with a calm devotion that did not require rest. To them, the unfolding of creation was a sacred procession. They witnessed the rise of mountains, the soft drifting of early clouds, and the first movements of life within the seas. Nothing escaped their notice, for nothing in these early ages was without meaning. Among these guardians were those whose tasks carried deeper weight. They observed the boundaries themselves, the sacred lines that separated heaven's purity from the earth's physical form. These boundaries were more than divisions. They were expressions of divine wisdom. They ensured that each realm remained true to its nature, that the heavens retained their holiness, and that the earth remained a place prepared for growth, learning, and gentle guidance. The world below responded to this oversight with effortless obedience. Winds drifted through forests with measured calm. The seas did not rise beyond their appointed shores. Even the earliest creatures moved according to patterns woven into their existence. Every sound was soft. Every motion was deliberate. The world existed in balance, as though creation itself breathed through every leaf and stone. Humanity lived within this harmony as part of the design. The first families walked the earth with unclouded awareness. Their steps were steady. Their hearts were unburdened. They lived not in haste, but in quiet communion with the land that had been shaped for them. They understood their position not through spoken instruction, but through the simple clarity of being placed within a world already whole. Their presence completed the early vision, yet did not disturb it. In these days, wisdom moved through creation like a gentle current. It did not need to be pursued. It simply rested upon the world. The ancient traditions speak of this time with reverence, describing it as a season of innocence before choices carried consequence. Humanity did not yet contend with darkness. Angels had not yet turned their faces from their appointed place. The boundaries between realms were respected without question. The balance was complete. The silence of this age was profound. It held both peace and promise. It was the silence of a world aligned with its purpose, untouched by disruption. There was no memory of rebellion. No shadow had yet fallen across the design. The watchers observed this stillness with understanding, for they knew that every beginning carries within it the seed of future change. Yet they did not fear this truth. They simply fulfilled their roles, anchored in obedience. As the early world unfolded, time seemed to deepen rather than pass. Each moment carried the weight of divine intention, yet moved with the softness of a leaf drifting upon calm waters. The earth grew, the heavens watched, the guardians upheld their stations, and humanity walked gently within the harmony crafted for them. This was the world before the waters, a world held together not by force but by balance, a world sustained by boundaries that preserved its purpose, a world in which silence was not emptiness but fullness. Everything awaited the unfolding of the ages, unaware that the calm foundation laid in these early days would one day be tested, reshaped, and remembered across generations. In the early ages, when the harmony of creation still rested upon the earth like a soft mantle, the watchers held their place upon the heights. They moved along the borders of heaven with calm devotion, guardians assigned to observe the world below. Their gaze stretched across valleys, seas, and rising settlements, witnessing the unfolding of human life with patience that did not waver. They were beings of light and duty, shaped for obedience, anchored in the wisdom of the Most High. For a long time their watch was steady. They held their stations without question, for their purpose had been woven into their very form. The Book of Enoch speaks of them as those who kept their first estate, beings who understood the holiness of their appointed realm. In these early ages, the boundary between heaven and earth remained unbroken. The watchers stood above, humanity lived below, and the two worlds observed one another from their rightful places. Yet as time slowly deepened, something began to change, not in a single moment but in a gradual stirring born from long observation. Humanity grew, families spread across the land. Life unfolded with patterns of joy, sorrow, hope, and struggle. The watchers witnessed this growth with increasing fascination. They saw the tenderness of human bonds, the fragile strength of mortal hearts, and the quiet persistence with which humanity shaped its days. The watchers were beings of spirit, untouched by the weight of flesh. Yet the mortal world held a quiet beauty that stirred them. The simplicity of human life, the rhythm of its seasons, the warmth of its connections, all of these awakened emotions the watchers had not fully known. Their task had been to observe, not to long. But longing does not always declare itself at once. It begins as curiosity. It deepens into admiration. And if left unchecked, it becomes desire. Ancient fragments speak of this shift with solemn restraint. They describe watchers who began to look upon the earth not as a realm to be guarded, but as a realm to be near. The distance between heaven and earth, once a sacred separation, started to feel like a veil too thin. Quiet thoughts formed in the hearts of these guardians, thoughts they did not yet speak aloud. Their duty called them to remain. Their desire pulled them to descend. This inner turning did not occur with haste. It unfolded over many seasons, like the slow bending of a great tree under years of wind. The watchers felt the weight of their conflicted hearts. They knew the boundaries that had been set. They knew the holiness of their place. Yet they also felt the pull of the world below, and this pull grew stronger with time. The ancient texts describe this tension with reverence. It was not a rebellion born from violence or ambition. It was a quiet struggle within beings who had never known struggle. They felt the ache of choice, a burden humanity carried daily but the watchers had never faced. Their nature had been shaped for obedience, yet their hearts reached toward something not appointed to them. Some among them tried to turn away from these longings. They deepened their vigilance. They strengthened their devotion. They reminded themselves of the realm from which they had been formed. But even as they held to their stations, they sensed that a shift was beginning. one that would not remain contained within a single heart, but would ripple through the ranks of the watchers like a soft, unsettling breeze. In those days, a subtle stillness settled across the heavens. It was the stillness of decision forming in silence. The watchers continued their tasks, yet their thoughts drifted toward the earth more often than before. They spoke little, for the weight of unspoken longing is often carried in quiet. The descent had not yet begun. No foot had touched the soil, no boundary had been crossed, but the seeds of change were sown. The early signs of departure from their appointed place had taken root, not in action but in desire. The watchers stood at the edge of an ancient choice, unaware of how deeply their decision would shape the ages to come. The quiet tension within the watchers deepened as the ages passed. What began as a gentle stirring became a persistent weight, settling over their thoughts like a dusk that would not lift. They continued to stand upon the heights, fulfilling their roles with outward faithfulness, yet their hearts drifted in slow circles around the world below. The lives of humankind, fragile, fleeting, and filled with simple warmth, held a gravity they could not dismiss. The Book of Enoch describes this unfolding with solemn clarity. It speaks of watchers whose gaze lingered too long upon the daughters of humankind, moved by the grace and vulnerability they saw. The texts do not portray this as sudden lust or reckless impulse, but as the quiet turning of celestial hearts unused to the pull of desire. The watchers had observed the earth since the earliest dawn, but now their obs. Arvation carried a depth of feeling that unsettled the order of their being. Their admiration was not merely for beauty. It was for the complexity of mortal experience, joy mingled with sorrow, hope rising from hardship, love forming despite the fragility of the flesh. These things awakened longing in the watchers, not only for companionship, but for participation in a realm that felt alive in ways the heavens had never required. They watched humanity laugh, labor, embrace, and endure. And something within them began to ache with a desire to understand that existence from within, rather than from above. Yet this desire carried a cost. The watchers knew the boundary between heaven and earth had been set for a reason. They knew their nature was not fashioned for the mortal world. They knew that crossing the threshold meant stepping away from the order that held creation in balance. And still, the longing remained. It grew silent roots within their hearts, roots that tightened with every passing season. Among the watchers, certain leaders felt this struggle most intensely. They gathered in quiet places along the firmament, speaking in hushed tones about the longing that troubled them. Their discussions were not heated. They were heavy with uncertainty. They asked whether their desire was truly forbidden or whether it was an unspoken part of a greater destiny. They wondered whether the Most High had placed humanity upon the earth not only for stewardship, but for fellowship. They questioned whether the boundary might be crossed without harm. These thoughts revealed the depth of their internal conflict. Duty still called to them. The sacred order still resonated within their spirits, yet the desire to descend grew stronger, fed by the closeness of the world below and the enduring beauty of human life. The watchers felt torn between two callings, obedience to the realm of their origin and yearning for the realm of their fascination. Some watchers resisted these thoughts with steadfast resolve. They strengthened their devotion, reminding themselves of the holiness of heaven. They chose silence, chosen duty, chosen distance. But others, the ones most affected by the pull of desire, found the divide within themselves growing sharper. They tried to withdraw their attention from the earth, yet their gaze always returned. They tried to dismiss their longing as passing, yet it took root with deeper persistence. A quiet warning echoed through the heavens, not spoken in words but felt as an unease. The watchers sensed that their thoughts had begun to drift toward a turning point. They felt the shadow of choice approaching, though no shadow yet touched the earth. Their hearts carried a weight that was neither rebellion nor righteousness, but something in between, something unresolved. Ancient fragments describe this moment with solemn restraint. The watchers stood on the threshold of a decision that would alter not only their fate, but the fate of the world they had been tasked to guard. Their longing was not born of malice. Their desire was not shaped by ambition. It was shaped by admiration, by yearning, by a longing for connection that had no place within the bounds of heaven. Still, the descent had not yet begun. The watchers lingered upon the heights, caught between realms, caught between callings. Their wings had not yet touched the wind of the lower world. Their feet had not yet pressed into the soil. But the quiet force drawing them downward continued to build, like an unseen tide rising hour by hour. They stood in the stillness of decision, aware that the next step, when taken, would change everything. The stillness that surrounded the watchers began to shift, almost imperceptibly at first, like the faint trembling of a boundary about to be crossed. Their longing had matured into something weightier, something that shaped their thoughts with unbroken persistence. They stood upon the heights with the same dignity they had always carried, yet the calm certainty that once defined them had begun to waver. From these heights the earth looked peaceful. Morning mist rose from valleys. Rivers shimmered beneath the dawn. Human families tended to their days with gentle purpose, sowing, gathering, resting, rising again. Nothing in these scenes hinted at disruption. Nothing warned humanity of the gaze fixed upon it from above. And yet in the hearts of the watchers, the turning of destiny had already begun. They assembled at quiet edges of the firmament, far from the places where holy fire marked the throne's brilliance. Their conversations were subdued, marked by hesitation rather than defiance. They spoke of longing as one speaks of an unhealed wound, carefully, acknowledging the weight of each word. Some questioned whether such desire could be sanctified. Others wondered if love, even when unexpected, might still bear a purpose none of them yet understood. Yet beneath these reflections lay a deeper truth. Their hearts were Changan. And change of this kind could not remain without consequence. The boundary between heaven and earth had always been clear. The watchers had been appointed to observe, not to join. Their place was above, not below. But desire tests boundaries in quiet ways, and the watchers felt themselves being drawn toward a choice they could no longer ignore. The Book of Enoch describes this moment with solemn gravity. It speaks of watchers who gathered in council and bound themselves with unspoken resolve, though their resolve wavered with uncertainty. They felt the pull of the human world like an unending current. They saw beauty where they once saw simplicity. They sensed possibility where they once saw distance. The lines that separated the realms began to blur, not in the heavens but within their own spirits. Yet even now, no foot had stepped beyond the boundary. The realm of earth remained untouched by their descent. The watchers still held their place, though barely. Their wings remained poised but unmoving. The tension within them reached a point where silence became heavier than speech. Some among them warned of danger. They reminded their companions that the order of creation rested upon obedience. They spoke of the holiness of their station, the purity of the realm they served, the balance that existed only because boundaries were honored. These warnings were not delivered with anger, but with sorrow, sorrow born from the knowledge that the hearts of their brethren had already turned. Others listened, torn between caution and longing, but longing had taken deeper root. It had grown through observation, through admiration, through the quiet wonder of seeing humanity live with a vulnerability unknown in the heavens. The watchers felt drawn not to power, but to connection, not to rebellion, but to closeness. They did not desire to overthrow order, only to step into a world that stirred something within them that the heavens had never awakened. This desire, however gentle, carried the weight of a fracture waiting to form. The watchers understood the seriousness of their thoughts. They knew the Most High had set boundaries with purpose, wisdom, and care. They knew heaven's purity was not meant to mix with the dust of earth. They knew their choice would ripple through creation in ways no being could foresee. Yet the slow pull of destiny continued, quiet but unrelenting. The final moments before their descent were filled with a deep, solemn calm. It was the calm that precedes a choice, the calm that rests at the edge of a path that cannot be undone once taken. The watchers stood upon the border of heaven, gazing upon the world that had captured their hearts. The wind that moved across the heights carried no command to stop them, yet no permission to proceed. They were beings of spirit poised between two callings. And in that poised silence, the first steps of their descent began, not with motion but with decision. In the quiet aftermath of the Watchers' descent, the earth began to change in ways subtle at first, then unmistakable. What had once been a world shaped by harmony now carried the early tremors of imbalance, though humanity did not yet understand the cause. The Watchers walked among mortals with a presence both gentle and unsettling, for beings shaped of spirit were never meant to dwell in flesh's nearness. Their union with humanity, spoken of with solemnity in the Book of Enoch, became the doorway through which a new generation entered the world, one unlike any that had walked the earth before. These children of mixed origin grew differently from the moment of their birth. They rose in stature with unnatural speed, towering above their kin before their youth had fully passed. Their limbs carried a strength that surpassed the measure of human endurance. Their voices echoed with resonance deeper than ordinary breath. Their eyes held a shadowed intensity, as though they carried within them the weight of two worlds, heaven's brightness and earth's dust, unable to rest in either. Ancient writings do not portray these beings as simple creatures of might. They describe them as troubled from the beginning, caught in a design that was never intended. Their spirits carried a spark of celestial fire, yet their bodies were bound to the soil. Their nature stretched in two directions, and this stretching created an inner restlessness that shaped their lives with sorrow. They were beings of great presence, yet they lacked the guidance that purity of origin provides. They felt the pull of the heavens but could not reach them. They felt the weight of earth but could not find rest upon it. Their hunger, mentioned in fragments from the Book of Giants, revealed this imbalance. It was not merely hunger for food but for fullness, an ache for stability, identity, and belonging. They consumed more than the earth could easily provide, their appetites reflecting the vast emptiness within them. Communities struggled under this burden, unable to satisfy the needs of those who grew beyond natural measure. Fields that once fed villages could not sustain the giants' demands. Rivers that nourished many were strained by the thirst of a few. Yet the giants were not born evil. Their early years, as preserved in scattered traditions, reveal moments of wonder. They learned swiftly. They displayed strength that inspired awe. Some showed loyalty to their human kin, protecting them from threats and lifting burdens too heavy for ordinary hands. In their towering forms existed the potential for greatness, yet this greatness was shadowed by the imbalance that defined their very being. The Watchers, now bound to the earth by their choices, watched their children with both pride and sorrow. They saw in them a reflection of their own conflicted hearts, a mixture of light and weight, aspiration and limitation. But the Watchers themselves could not provide the guidance required. Their place had been forfeited, their clarity dimmed. The giants, left without a true path, grew into power without direction. As they matured, the giants began to feel their difference more sharply. They saw the fear in human eyes. They sensed the strain their presence placed upon the land. They realized that the world was not shaped to hold their vastness, and this awareness created a deep, unspoken grief. They were too great for the earth, too bound for the heavens, too restless for peace. Over time, their restlessness manifested outwardly. Some wandered across the land in search of purpose. Some sought challenges to match their strength. Others turned their frustration into dominance, using their might to command what they could not understand. The harmony of creation, once steady and calm, now trembled beneath the weight of beings who existed outside its original design. The birth of the giants marked a turning point in the ancient world. Their presence altered landscapes, influenced nations, and shaped the memories of generations. The earth groaned beneath the strain of their enormity, and human communities began to feel the first signs of disruption. Yet beneath every story of power lay a deeper truth. The giants were children born into imbalance, carrying burdens they could never set down. They were not monsters, but tragedies, living reminders of a boundary crossed and a harmony disturbed. As the giants grew into the fullness of their stature, the earth felt their presence with increasing weight. Their footprints left impressions deeper than any creature before them. Their shadows stretched long across valleys. Their movements stirred the ground, not through anger, but through sheer magnitude. The world, once shaped to cradle gentler forms, now strained beneath beings whose existence exceeded the boundaries of natural design. Ancient writings describe these early days with quiet sorrow. Jubilee speaks of them as beings who became great in height and great in ruin, not because ruin was their desire, but because they were shaped by circumstances that offered them no rest. The Book of Giants preserves fragments of their voices, expressions of confusion, longing, and dreams heavy with symbols they could not interpret. They walked the earth as strangers in the realm that had given them birth. Their restlessness deepened as they matured. Though their physical strength seemed limitless, their spirits bore an instability that grew with each passing season. They possessed the instincts of mortals yet carried the unrooted fire of the Watchers. They were capable of affection, yet their emotions shifted with a force they could not control. When they sought companionship, their presence overwhelmed. When they sought peace, their minds stirred with unease. They longed for belonging, but found no place where their greatness could settle without causing fear or strain. For a time, some giants sought to live gently among human communities. They aided in labor too difficult for ordinary hands. They guarded fields from wild beasts. They lifted fallen trees and cleared paths through dense forests. Their acts were not always destructive. Many were born from a desire to help, to contribute, to find purpose beside those who had given them life. But their very nature made balance elusive. A single misstep could break what human hands had built. A moment of emotion could shake the foundations of a dwelling. Their size, their strength, their hunger, each magnified every aspect of their presence. Humanity, though initially hopeful, began to experience the strain of living alongside such beings. Crops diminished as the giants' needs grew. Storehouses emptied. Wells ran dry sooner than expected. Even the land itself seemed to bow beneath the burden of sustaining them. Conflicts arose not from malice but from desperation. Communities that had once known peace now faced decisions they had never imagined. How to feed those who consumed more than fields could yield. How to protect families without provoking the giant's sorrow or anger. The Watchers looked upon these developments with heavy hearts. Their children reflected the consequences of their own departure from divine order. The giants bore qualities of both heaven and earth, yet belonged fully to neither. They possessed faculties too vast for mortal frameworks, yet lacked the clarity that heaven had once granted their fathers. The Watchers saw the imbalance in their children grow with every passing day, and they understood that the world itself was bending beneath the weight of their lineage. Regional traditions, preserved in scattered fragments, describe the giants wandering across wide territories in search of meaning. Some traveled great distances, seeking regions less populated, hoping their immense presence might find space away from human fragility. Others lingered near the settlements where they had been raised, unwilling to abandon the only bonds they had ever known. But whether wandering or remaining, each carried within them a sense of isolation that deepened with time. Their dreams, recorded in the Book of Giants, revealed an awareness of the imbalance they embodied. They saw visions of falling stars, collapsing mountains, and waters rising. These dreams were not mere fancies. They were premonitions shaped by the instability within their spirits. They sensed that the harmony of the world was beginning to tremble, not through intentional wrongdoing, but through the simple fact of their existence. They had been born into a world not designed to hold them, and the world responded with strain. The giants' relationships with one another reflected this inner turmoil. Some formed bonds of kinship, seeking unity in those who shared their burden. Others drifted apart, driven by restlessness that denied lasting peace. Their emotions, intense and unbounded, sometimes led to conflicts that shook the land. Even their sorrow carried the force of storms. The earth, sensitive to every tremor of their presence, echoed their unrest in ways humanity could not ignore. Through it all, a quiet tragedy began to unfold. The giants were not creators of chaos by nature. They were shaped by circumstances they did not choose. Their strength, which could have been a blessing, became a source of disruption. Their hunger, which reflected their vastness, became a strain upon those who had once welcomed them. Their longing, rooted in the duality of their origins, became a force that pulled them toward paths they could not fully understand. The world began to tilt under their presence. What had once been harmony now carried the faint tremor of imbalance. The birth of the giants had opened a doorway through which the earth felt the early signs of disruption, not yet destruction, but the quiet beginning of fracture. As seasons turned and the giants continued to grow in number and stature, the earth's quiet tremor deepened into a steady strain. Their immense presence reshaped the land. Seascapes they walked upon, hills compressed under their weight, trees bent aside as they passed. The rivers they crossed widened from repeated steps, their banks pushed outward by force that nature had never been asked to bear. Each movement of a giant altered the world in some small way, and over time, these changes began to echo across entire regions. Yet their power alone was not what altered creation. It was their inner turmoil, vast, unanchored, and unrelenting. The giants lived with spirits too great for their bodies, and bodies too great for the earth. Their dual origin pulled at them from both realms, leaving them unsettled in thought and action. Wisdom traditions preserved in ancient writings suggest that the giants were often troubled by visions and dreams, sensing realities beyond the reach of human understanding. These inner storms, when left unspoken, grew into outward expressions that shook the land. The Book of Giants preserves fragments of these dreams, symbols of falling stones, darkened skies, and rising floods. These visions did not appear as prophecies born from rebellion, but as reflections of their spiritual imbalance, a mirror of the disruption their existence introduced. Some giants sought meaning in these visions. They questioned their purpose. They wondered why they felt torn between light and earth. But answers did not come easily, for the watchers who had fathered them were themselves caught in a state of exile, unable to offer clarity. In certain regions, the giants attempted to form communities among themselves, hoping that unity might quiet the unrest within. For a time, these gatherings brought temporary peace. They shared stories, strength, and the comfort of recognition, beings who understood one another's burdens without explanation. But even in these moments, harmony proved fragile. Their emotions, magnified by the dual nature of their existence, often swelled beyond control. Disputes between giants could level forests and scatter animals for miles. Their sorrow could cause trembling in the ground. Their passions, fierce and unbound, rippled outward as forces stronger than intent. Human communities, increasingly aware of the giants' inner conflict, responded in varied ways. Some sought to honor them, believing that reverence might ease their unrest. Offerings of food, shelter, and respect were given in hopes of maintaining peace. Others withdrew in fear, relocating to distant lands, choosing caution over proximity, and still others attempted to bargain with the giants, hoping to guide their strength toward protection rather than disruption. But none of these approaches offered more than temporary stability, for the giants could not escape the imbalance that shaped their very being. Over time, stories of their deeds, both noble and troubling, spread across the earth. Some giants acted as guardians, defending villages from wild beasts or rival tribes. Their presence turned away threats that would have overwhelmed humankind. But other giants, driven by frustration and hunger, lashed out at the world around them. Their actions, though born from inner turmoil, carried consequences far beyond their intentions. The Watchers looked upon their children with a mixture of love and grief. They saw in them the evidence of a choice that had altered the course of creation. The giants bore the radiance of the heavens, yet lacked the stability of those realms. They bore the substance of earth, yet were too vast for its design. The Watchers' own hearts carried the weight of this knowledge. They recognized the sorrow of beings born into conflict not of their choosing. Regional traditions speak of a decline in the harmony that once defined the early world. Fields grew barren where giants repeatedly passed. Waterways shifted. Human settlements fractured under the pressure of accommodating such immense beings. Even the animals sensed the change, fleeing from regions where the giants walked too frequently. The world's order, once steady and calm, felt the strain of imbalance pressing against its foundations. Yet amid these growing disturbances, the giants themselves remained deeply tragic figures. Their restlessness was not born of evil. Their hunger was not shaped by greed. Their power was not driven by deliberate malice. They were beings caught between realms, living in bodies that magnified every burden. Their size made them feared. Their origins made them misunderstood. Their existence, though unintended, was bound to the unfolding destiny of the earth. As the ancient texts suggest, the earth could not bear their presence forever. The strain that began as a whisper now grew into a quiet warning, an acknowledgement that the harmony of creation was nearing its breaking point. The giants stood at the center of this tension, not as deliberate destroyers, but as living symbols of a world beginning to fracture under the weight of choices made beyond the earth's design. Long after the footsteps of the giants faded from the valleys they once shook, their memory lived on, not in the great monuments of stone or in inscriptions carved by their own hands, but in fragile traces left by those who witnessed their age. The stories of their birth, their rise, and their troubled presence settled into the hearts of communities scattered across the ancient world. These memories did not remain in a single place. They traveled across deserts, through mountains, and along the paths of wandering tribes. They moved like soft winds, carrying echoes of a world that had once strained beneath beings too vast for its soil. In time, scribes and elders began to gather these echoes, preserving them in the only ways they could: on parchment, on clay, on tattered scrolls hidden deep within secluded chambers. The earliest accounts were simple, shaped by the voices of those who had lived near the shadows of the giants. Later writings grew more refined, shaped by reflection rather than direct sight, yet still carrying the weight of remembrance. Each fragment held a piece of a story too important to release into forgetting. Some of these writings later formed the foundation of the Book of Enoch, a text that wove together visions, warnings, and histories that stretched far beyond what the canonical scriptures would one day contain. Others remained as isolated tablets, broken, scattered, incomplete. Still others were recited for generations, carried by communities whose wandering lives made written preservation difficult. Their stories survived through the steady rhythm of memory spoken aloud beneath starlit skies. Across the ages, these accounts faced danger not from time alone, but from forces that sought to silence them. Some communities viewed the tales of the giants as too troubling, too heavy, too intertwined with sorrowful truths about the Watchers' departure from their appointed place. These stories revealed wounds within creation, wounds not easily discussed. As a result, Certain traditions attempted to bury them, to hide them beneath teachings less weighty, or to seal them within archives closed to common sight. Yet even in hiding, the fragments endured. In distant deserts, sects devoted to purity preserved scrolls that spoke of the giants and the watchers. They believed that understanding the failures of previous ages would guard their own communities against similar disruption. These sects carefully stored their writings within caves, sealed pottery jars, and hidden chambers carved into limestone cliffs. Time passed, kingdoms fell, and empires rose, yet the scrolls remained untouched, protected by silence and stone. Elsewhere, families who had carried memories across generations wove the stories into their oral traditions. Around fires, elders recounted the ancient days when beings of vast stature had walked the earth. They spoke not to inspire fear, but to preserve wisdom, reminding each new generation that the boundary between realms was once crossed, and that the world had trembled in response. Even when the words were not written, they endured through the faithful weight of repetition. In exile, scribes carried tablets inscribed with symbols older than their own wandering. These tablets often bore marks of long travel, chipped edges, faded characters, fractures filled with dust from distant lands. Yet the stories remained legible enough to convey their message. They spoke of watchers who had descended, of giants born into imbalance, and of a world whose harmony had once strained beneath their presence. These tablets became treasures among displaced peoples, preserved not for glory, but for remembrance. Across all these regions and traditions, one truth remained constant. The accounts of the giants refused erasure. They survived in fragments, in whispers, in scrolls hidden beneath layers of stone and sand. They survived because those who guarded them believed that memory, however fragile, was a necessary witness. They understood that these ancient stories were not meant to vanish. They existed to remind later generations of choices that had shaped the world in ways both subtle and profound. As time moved forward, the hidden scrolls and lost accounts waited in silence, waiting for the day when they would be found, read, and understood once more. Their survival was not the work of chance. It was the work of those who honored memory enough to carry it through ages of uncertainty. And through these surviving fragments, the story of the giants continued to breathe across the centuries, refusing to fade. As centuries unfolded, the hidden writings rested in places where sunlight rarely reached. In desert caves, the dry air preserved the ink with a gentleness that time alone could not offer. In mountain sanctuaries, scrolls lay wrapped in linen and oil, guarded by communities who believed that the ancient world's failures carried lessons too sacred to lose. In distant valleys, elders preserved the same stow. Rise through unbroken chains of memory, letting each generation hold those words long enough to pass them forward. These writings often lived at the edges of empires, far from the centers of power where official chronicles were shaped. They were trusted not by kings or governors, but by shepherds, wanderers, teachers, and scribes who believed that the past spoke in ways that parchment alone could not contain. The fragments did not travel in caravans of trade or sit in halls of prestige. They remained close to the earth, close to the families who remembered the early world with reverence. Many scrolls were preserved by communities who felt that the giants' story revealed the fragile boundary between obedience and desire. They studied the Watcher's descent, the birth of the giants, and the gradual unraveling of harmony, seeing in these accounts a mirror for the weaknesses that dwell in every age. For them, these writings were not curiosities. They were warnings, reminders that choices made in silence can shape generations yet unborn. And so they protected the scrolls with care, even when doing so placed them under suspicion from those who preferred simpler histories. Some of the lost accounts were carried by exiles, people forced from their homelands by conquest or famine. They gathered their belongings quickly, clothing, tools, small treasures, and among these possessions they hid their tablets and scrolls. Even in displacement, they refused to abandon the memories of the early world. A clay tablet bearing a half-erased account of a giant's dream might travel hundreds of miles, carried in a satchel through storms, across borders, along roads worn by the desperate steps of entire nations. Such fragments survived because those who held them believed that forgetting the past was more dangerous than exile itself. In other regions, oral memory endured where written words could not. Wandering tribes who moved with the seasons carried the stories with them across long stretches of land. By the glow of evening fires, the elders spoke of ages when the earth trembled under enormous strides, when the watchers bent the boundary between heaven and earth, and when the world learned the cost of imbalance. These spoken accounts shifted in tone from region to region, but their core remained unchanged. They kept alive the memory of a world altered by beings who were never meant to walk upon its soil. Cultural forces, however, often pushed against these stories. As new kingdoms rose and new traditions formed their own identities, older memories became inconvenient. Some leaders feared that tales of giants and fallen watchers would stir questions about the nature of authority, obedience, and divine order. Others simply wished to create a cleaner historical record, one without the weight of ancient sorrow. And so attempts were made to silence the accounts, to bury them beneath official narratives, to label them as fables unworthy of preservation. Yet despite these efforts, the fragments endured. For every scroll sealed away in restricted archives, another remained hidden in a cave. For every tablet dismissed by scholars, another was quietly protected by a family who understood its value. For every tradition that sought to erase the giants, another retold their story with gentle solemnity. The memory of the early ages persisted not because it was favored, but because it carried truths that time could not smother. In the deserts, where silence reigns and wind shapes the landscape, scrolls containing stories of the watchers slept beneath layers of sand and stone. These scrolls remained untouched for centuries, surviving the fall of kingdoms and the passage of countless generations. The quiet air preserved them, the isolation protected them, and the reverence of those who had hidden them ensured that they would not be lost entirely. Across these regions, the fragments formed a tapestry of remembrance, not perfect, not complete, yet unified in purpose. They bore witness to a world that had once carried beings too vast for its design, and to the choices that had brought about imbalance. Each preserved piece, whether written or spoken, became a vessel through which memory flowed, refusing to yield to the silence of forgetting. As these fragments endured, they prepared the way for later ages to rediscover them. Ages that would read their words, confront their warnings, and remember a world once shaped by giants and the watchers who descended. Through the long quiet of centuries, the fragments continued their patient journey, some carried by human hands, others hidden in earth and stone, and still others held only within the breath of memory. Their survival was not loud. It was not triumphant. It was steady, subtle, and enduring, shaped by the belief that certain stories must not be allowed to vanish, even when the world no longer welcomes them. Among the most significant of these preserved writings were the records kept by secluded sects who withdrew into desert regions. These groups lived apart from the noise of cities, choosing lives of reflection, discipline, and silence. They believed that the purity of faith required remembrance of the earliest ages, ages when the boundary between heaven and earth had been crossed, and when creation bore the weight of imbalance. For them, the writings concerning the giants and the watchers were not curiosities, but essential testimonies. They copied these texts with unwavering care, committing each stroke to parchment with the solemn understanding that they were guarding warnings meant for future generations. Some scrolls survived because they were hidden within clay vessels, sealed tightly, and placed in caverns untouched by the world above. There they remained, preserved by the dryness of the desert and the isolation of time. When discovered in later ages, the scrolls were fragile, yet their ink still carried the voices of those who had lived near the shadows of the giants. Passages describing their birth, their troubled nature, and their impact upon the earth revealed that memory had not faded entirely. These writings connected distant generations with a world long gone, offering a window into the age when the Watchers walked the borderlines of heaven and earth. Elsewhere, communities in distant lands preserved the stories through ritual recitation. They gathered at appointed times to speak of the early world, not to glorify the giants, but to acknowledge the lessons woven into their existence. The elders recounted how the giants had strained the earth, how their hunger pressed upon fields, how their restlessness shook the foundations of villages. They spoke of the Watchers' descent and the sorrow that followed. These recitations ensured that even when written scrolls were scattered or destroyed, the memory endured through spoken tradition. There were also writings carried far from their origins by the tides of migration. Families who left their homelands, driven by war, famine, or the collapse of kingdoms, kept fragments wrapped in cloth and placed among their few remaining possessions. A small tablet bearing the mark of a giant's dream might pass through the hands of shepherds, merchants, and refugees, traveling leagues beyond the region of its birth. Though chipped and worn, these pieces remained part of the lineage of remembrance. They reminded their bearers that the world had once held wonders and sorrows far beyond their own. Yet the survival of these texts was not without resistance. Many cultures, seeking order and cohesion, preferred to anchor their histories in clearer, less troubling narratives. The stories of giants, beings too vast for the earth, born of unions that crossed divine boundaries, challenged the simplicity of later teachings. As a result, some communities attempted to suppress these writings, storing them in locked archives or dismissing them as myth. But memory that carries truth is not easily buried. Even when pushed into obscurity, the accounts found ways to re-emerge. Through a fragment in a marketplace, a scroll unearthed by accident, or a tale whispered among elders. What remained consistent across all surviving sources was a reverent tone. The scribes did not record the giants to inspire fear or fascination. They recorded them to preserve understanding. They knew that the early world had carried a fragile balance, and that when the Watchers stepped beyond their appointed place, that balance shifted in ways creation could not sustain. The writings served as reminders of this shift. They were lanterns set along the path of history, glowing softly in the darkness of forgetting. Each scroll, tablet, fragment, or spoken account became a vessel for memory. They held not only the story of the giants, but the story of human devotion to truth, even truth that troubled the heart. They bore witness to the resilience of remembrance and to the belief that some lessons must endure, even when written in the fragile ink of ancient hands. Through these preserved pieces, the early world remained alive. The giants walked again in memory. The Watchers descended again in story. And the balance that once strained beneath their presence continued to speak across the ages, offering gentle warning to any who would listen. In the generations that followed, the earth no longer moved with the calm rhythm of earlier ages. What had begun as a quiet strain beneath the footsteps of the giants had grown into something heavier, something that reached beyond the soil and into the hearts of humankind. The imbalance that began in the heavens and took form upon the earth now unfolded in ways both visible and unseen. Ancient writings describe this shift with solemn clarity, for they knew that corruption does not arrive with sudden violence. It rises slowly, like shadows lengthening at dusk. As the giants matured, their restlessness deepened. Their strength, once a source of awe, became a force without restraint. Some turned their frustration into violence, not from deliberate cruelty, but because their emotions surged with a magnitude the world could not contain. A single moment of anger could shatter stones. A single blow could level dwellings. Their presence, already too vast for the earth, now became a catalyst for further disruption. What the land tolerated in their youth, it could no longer endure. Humanity, already strained by the giants' needs, now faced challenges that touched both body and spirit. Conflicts arose where none had existed before. Tribes fought over land diminished by the giants' hunger. Families quarreled as fear replaced fellowship. Hearts that once walked in innocence now drifted toward suspicion, rivalry, and despair. Wisdom, once sought in humility, became a tool for advantage. Strength, once used for protection, became a measure of dominance. The early world, shaped by harmony, now carried the first signs of moral fracture. The Book of Enoch and other ancient fragments speak with grief about these days. They describe how violence spread across the land like an unrelenting wind, sweeping through villages and cities alike. The giants, troubled in spirit, often served as both symbols and instruments of this unrest. When their internal turmoil erupted outward, entire regions felt the consequences. Fields were scorched, settlements scattered. Paths that once flowed with peace were marked by fear. Yet the corruption did not rest solely in the giants. Humanity, influenced by the instability around them, began to drift from the ways of righteousness. The stories handed down through generations were forgotten or neglected. The reverence that once guided their steps grew dim. Where obedience had flourished, pride now took root. Where generosity had been common, greed began to stir. The world that had once reflected divine intention now bore the marks of a deeper disorder. Wisdom, too, became a path misused. The Watchers had once shared knowledge meant to guide and uplift, but in the hands of those who had drifted from truth, this wisdom became distorted. Skills intended for healing were twisted toward harm. Teachings meant for understanding were used to manipulate. The balance between knowledge and humility vanished, replaced by ambition untempered by righteousness. In this way, the corruption that began in the heart spread outward into the works of human hands. Genesis captures the weight of this moment with simple, piercing words, that the thoughts of humanity had turned toward violence and that corruption filled the earth. These were not merely acts of wrongdoing but reflections of a world unbalanced at every level, cosmic, physical, and spiritual. The giants, towering manifestations of imbalance, amplified every distortion around them. Their footsteps echoed the unrest within their hearts, and the earth trembled beneath both. Yet even in the midst of corruption, divine sorrow is felt in the ancient writings. The Most High looked upon creation not with sudden anger, but with grief. The world had drifted far from its intended harmony. What had been shaped for order now bore wounds that deepened with every passing generation. The suffering of humanity, the turmoil of the giants, and the restlessness of creation itself formed a chorus of lament. The imbalance that began with a single choice now touched every corner of the earth. Still, judgment in these texts is never portrayed as wrathful destruction. It is described as restoration, a return to order, a cleansing that allows creation to breathe again. But that restoration had not yet arrived. The world continued to strain beneath the giants' presence and humanity's corruption. The earth itself, described in ancient writings as groaning under the weight of imbalance, awaited the moment when the divine hand would intervene. For now, the corruption deepened like gathering clouds before an unseen storm. The consequences of choices made long ago had matured, and the world stood on the edge of change, though no one yet understood how soon that change would come. As the imbalance widened across the earth, the early world entered a season of quiet dissonance. What had once been harmony now unfolded in fractured tones. The presence of the giants, immense in both body and spirit, amplified every disturbance. Their sorrow became storms. Their anger shook the ground. Their hunger strained the land. Their wandering left regions unsettled, unable to recover before the next wave of disturbance arrived. Humanity felt this unrest not only in the body, but in the soul. The moral clarity that once guided daily life became clouded. The path of righteousness, once walked with ease, now seemed distant beneath a growing tide of fear and desire. Communities that had once lived in unity now found themselves divided. Suspicion whispered between neighbors. Ambition stirred among leaders. The pressure of survival bent hearts in directions they had never imagined. Ancient texts describe this generation with quiet grief. The Book of Enoch speaks of hearts turning toward injustice, of deeds shaped by selfishness rather than reverence. Genesis echoes this transformation, noting that the earth was filled with violence, a phrase that carries not only physical destruction but the corrosion of conscience. The corruption touched every layer of existence: homes, fields, councils, and the private chambers of thought. Some giants, driven by inner turmoil, became forces of devastation. Their immense strength, once an expression of the wonder they carried, now manifested as destruction when their emotions surged beyond restraint. They toppled structures in moments of frustration, not always intending harm, but leaving ruin nonetheless. Their presence in disputes between tribes could determine outcomes before a single human word was spoken. With one gesture, they could alter the landscape of entire communities. Other giants struggled against this fate. They sought solitude, wandering mountains and barren lands in search of peace. Their isolation became a testament to their sorrow. These beings, born neither fully of heaven nor earth, felt the discord within themselves deepen with every passing season. They longed for stillness, yet their very existence stirred the world around them. Humanity, too, bore responsibility in this age of corruption. Knowledge passed down from the Watchers, meant to heal, cultivate, and guide, was twisted into tools of harm. Skills once used for protection became instruments of domination. Traditions meant to preserve wisdom were reshaped to justify ambition. The boundary between righteous action and self-serving intent blurred. Where reverence had once nurtured peace, pride now overshadowed humility. Families passed down stories of the early world, but the lessons contained within them grew faint under the weight of survival. Children learned fear before they learned faith. Leaders sought power before seeking understanding. The giants loomed in the background of every choice, shaping the world's moral landscape in ways few recognized until the consequences had already taken root. The corruption reached beyond humanity and the giants. It touched creation itself. The soil grew weary under the strain of endless consumption. Rivers, once clear, became muddied by upheaval. Forests were uprooted by conflict or by the simple passage of beings too large for the world that held them. The harmony that once flowed from mountain to valley now seemed fragmented, interrupted by tremors of imbalance that traveled far beyond their origin. Yet amid this growing darkness, the ancient texts carry a thread of quiet reflection. They speak of divine patience, of a sorrow that sees through the surface of chaos to the deeper wounds beneath. The Most High does not appear as a distant ruler unmoved by suffering, but as one who grieves the corruption of creation. Judgment, in these writings, is portrayed not as vengeance, but as the gentle necessity of restoration. The world, overwhelmed by imbalance, longed for renewal even as it drifted farther from its intended peace. Communities that recognized the spreading corruption sought refuge in righteousness. They withdrew from the violence of the age, choosing quiet paths of obedience. Their small acts of faithfulness offered glimmers of hope, though these lights often flickered beneath the weight of the world's growing unrest. Still, they endured, carrying the memory of what creation had once been. But the currents of corruption flowed more swiftly with each passing generation. The giants, unable to escape their troubled nature, continued to shape the world in ways neither they nor humanity could fully contain. The Watchers, bound by their own fall from order, could not guide their children back to peace. Humanity, drifting between fear and desire, lost its footing on the paths of righteousness. And so the ancient world moved steadily toward a moment of reckoning, not born of sudden wrath, but of long-awaited balance. The consequences of cosmic imbalance had reached the earth's foundations, and creation itself seemed to hold its breath. As the corruption of the age settled into its fullest depth, the earth felt as though it stood beneath a gathering weight, a heaviness not born of a single cause, but of countless threads woven together across generations. The giants, burdened by their troubled origins, walked the land with spirits straining against their very nature. Humanity, shaped by fear and pride, drifted further from righteousness. And creation itself, sensitive to every tremor of imbalance, groaned beneath the mounting disorder. This was not a moment that arrived suddenly. It unfolded gradually, like a long dusk stretching across the sky. Each small departure from the path of righteousness deepened the twilight. Each act of violence carried echoes that spread far beyond the one who dealt it. Each misuse of wisdom passed down from the watchers added another weight to the growing imbalance. Over time, these echoes formed a chorus, a lament that rose from the soil, the rivers, the forests, and the fractured hearts of humankind. The apocryphal writings speak of this era with solemn clarity. The Book of Enoch describes the cries of the oppressed rising to the heavens, carried by winds that seemed weary of their burden. Jubilee speaks of communities devoured by conflict, unable to restore peace once it had slipped from their grasp. Genesis, in its simplicity, captures the depth of the world's corruption with a single truth: that the thoughts of humanity continually bent toward violence. It was a violence not only of action, but of intention, a deviation from the divine order that once anchored creation. Amid this turmoil, the giants stood as both symbols and instruments of the world's unraveling. Their immense strength, shaped by a mixture they did not choose, often erupted in ways that magnified suffering. Disputes they entered into, whether willingly or in frustration, left devastation in their wake. Their emotions, magnified by the imbalance within their spirits, could shift weather, topple structures, and alter landscapes. Even their attempts at peace were shadowed by the fear their presence evoked. Yet the giants themselves were not devoid of sorrow. Ancient fragments describe moments when they lamented the paths their lives had taken, moments when visions troubled their sleep, showing images of rising waters, collapsing mountains, and stars falling from the firmament. These visions, often dismissed by their companions, were glimpses of the judgment that would one day cleanse the earth. They sensed the nearing consequence, but could not escape the destiny shaped by their birth. Humanity, too, bore the weight of its choices. Communities that once lived with reverence now shaped their days around survival and dominance. Leaders used the knowledge gifted by the watchers to strengthen their own power rather than guide their people. Craftsmen forged tools not for cultivation, but for conflict. Even the earth's resources were taken with little regard for the balance they once protected. In such an age, righteousness became a rarity, preserved by only a few whose quiet obedience stood as a faint reminder of what creation had once been. Through all of this, the Most High is depicted in the ancient writings not as distant or unmoved, but as grieving. The corruption of the world was not merely the breaking of rules, it was the distortion of harmony, the unraveling of purpose, the suffering of beings who had been shaped for peace. Divine judgment, therefore, did not arise from anger but from compassion, a necessary act to restore balance where balance had been lost. Judgment in these texts is portrayed as cleansing rather than destruction. It is the restoration of order to a world overwhelmed by imbalance. The rising waters, whispered of in the visions of giants and prophets alike, were not sent to erase creation, but to heal it, to wash away the weight of corruption that no longer allowed the world to breathe. In the final days before this restoration, creation seemed to hold its breath. The giants felt an unease they could not name. Humanity sensed a shift but could not discern its meaning. Even the wind carried a quiet heaviness, as if bracing for a change that hovered just beyond sight. The watchers, bound in their sorrow, understood that their descent had sown seeds whose harvest now approached. The chapter draws its meaning from these moments when imbalance reached its fullness, when corruption touched every corner of existence, and when the world awaited the gentle yet decisive intervention of the Most High. It is a reflection on how choices, whether made by heavenly beings or humankind, ripple through creation in ways profound and far-reaching. And it prepares the path for the judgment that would follow, not as an act of wrath, but as the necessary restoration of the world's broken harmony. The final days of the ancient world did not begin with thunder. They began with a stillness, an uncanny quiet that settled upon the land like a veil drawn across fading light. The earth, strained by generations of imbalance, seemed to pause in anticipation. Rivers slowed, winds softened. Even the giants whose restlessness had once echoed across mountains felt a heaviness within their spirits. They sensed a change approaching, a turning of the age, though its form remained hidden from their understanding. In the writings of Genesis, the Most High gazed upon the world and saw that corruption had reached its fullness. Violence had spread not only through human hands, but through intentions shaped by fear, pride, and sorrow. The giants, born of the Watcher's descent, stood as towering reminders of a boundary crossed and a harmony undone. The weight of creation's suffering rose like a lament to the heavens. Yet the divine response came not with fury, but with sorrow, deep, quiet sorrow for a world that had strayed far from its intended peace. As the appointed days approached, signs began to stir across the land. Clouds gathered in patterns the elders had never witnessed. The light dimmed, though no storm yet broke. Animals moved with unease, altering their paths as if guided by instincts older than memory. The voices of prophets, those few who still walked in righteousness, spoke warnings that were met with disbelief, for the world had grown accustomed to turmoil and could not imagine a cleansing that would reach beyond its borders. Noah, described in Genesis as a man upright in a generation of brokenness, received instructions to prepare an ark, a vessel that would preserve life through the coming judgment. His work unfolded slowly, marked by obedience rather than understanding. Each plank of wood, each measured angle, each sealed joint became a quiet testimony to faith amid corruption. As he built, the world continued its descent into chaos, unaware that these final labors would become the bridge between one age and the next. At last the skies began to change. Rain, gentle at first, fell upon the land. Then the heavens opened. Waters surged from above and below, meeting in a force that creation had not seen since its earliest dawn. Rivers broke their banks. Seas rose beyond their borders. Springs burst from the deep. The world that had once been shaped in calm boundaries now dissolved beneath the unrelenting ascent of waters. The giants, whose vast strength had once seemed unshakable, felt the limits of their power. Their height, once a symbol of might, offered no refuge from the rising flood. Some attempted to flee to the highest mountains, their massive forms climbing slopes that crumbled under their weight. Others stood defiant against the rushing waters, striking the waves as though their force could hold back the decree of heaven. But the flood did not distinguish between great and small. It moved with a purpose beyond strength and resistance. The giants, burdened by their troubled nature, met their end not through battle, but through the inevitable rise of the waters that cleansed the world. Humanity, too, faced the consequence of its corruption. Voices cried out across valleys and plains, carried by winds already thick with rain. Families sought refuge on rooftops, hills, and cliffs, only to watch these places vanish beneath the advancing sea. The flood carried not anger but finality. It swept away violence, pride, greed, and sorrow. It washed clean the wounds inflicted by ages of imbalance. The world that had once known the footsteps of giants faded beneath a vast silence. Inside the ark, Noah and his family waited as waters rose around them. The sound of rain hammered against the vessel until even that sound became part of the silence, a silence shaped by the absence of voices, by the passing of an age, by the grief of creation itself. The ark drifted upon waters that stretched endlessly in every direction. No tree, no hill, no dwelling broke the horizon. Only the slow movement of waves beneath a sky emptied of its familiar constellations. Traditions across cultures echo this moment. Some speak of a deluge sent to wash away corruption. Others describe a cosmic sea reclaiming the land. Still others recount how divine beings mourned the loss of a world that had been shaped with such care. Though the details vary, the heart of the story remains the same. The flood came not as wrath alone, but as cleansing, a restoration of order to a world overwhelmed by imbalance. As the waters covered the earth, silence settled upon creation. It was the silence that follows upheaval, the silence of a world paused between destruction and renewal. This silence held the memory of the age now gone, the rise of the Watchers, the birth of the giants, the slow unfolding of corruption. It also held the quiet promise of what would come after, a world made new, shaped once more by divine intention. But before renewal, the silence deepened, stretching across the waters like a great, solemn breath. The silence that followed the first surge of the waters carried a weight unlike anything the world had ever known. It was not the silence of peace, nor the silence of emptiness. It was the silence of endings, a hush that settled over mountains now hidden beneath the deep, over valleys filled with drifting currents, over cities and settlements erased by the rising flood. The world that had echoed with the footsteps of giants, with the quarrels of humankind, and with the restless sighs of creation now lay beneath a vast and solemn stillness. The rains continued, unbroken, descending from heavens that seemed to grieve the transformation unfolding below. The waters from the deep pressed upward with equal force, meeting the downpour until the boundaries between sky and sea blurred into a single expanse. Night and day lost their distinction beneath this veil. Clouds swallowed the sun. Stars withdrew. Time itself seemed to drift, measured not by the turning of light, but by the ceaseless rhythm of rain striking the surface of the flood. Within this vastness, the fate of the giants reached its final chapter. Ancient accounts emphasize their struggle not with triumph but with sorrow. These beings, born of mixed origins, had lived lives marked by internal conflict. Their immense strength, once a source of awe and fear, now brought them no refuge. Their towering forms were submerged as the waters climbed. Their cries, once capable of shaking hills, faded beneath the roar of the flood. Some fragments suggest that the giants, sensing the nearness of their end, attempted to lift their voices toward the heavens, not in defiance but in grief, not in anger but in longing. They were beings caught between realms, and in their final moments, their divided nature became a lamentation carried upon the rising waters. Yet the flood did not yield. It fulfilled its purpose, the cleansing of a world that had fallen out of balance. Humanity faced its own reckoning in these days. Entire generations disappeared beneath the currents. Structures built over lifetimes dissolved in moments. The flood carried away both the innocent and the guilty, not as an act of disregard, but as a consequence of a world overwhelmed by the accumulated weight of corruption. The ancient writings speak with profound restraint here, describing not rage from above, but sorrow, the sorrow of a creator whose once harmonious world had become a place of unrelenting violence. Within the ark, Noah and his family listened to the muffled world outside. They heard the relentless hammering of rain, the groaning of the vessel under shifting waves, and then, gradually, the deepening quiet as life beyond the ark receded. The ark became a floating sanctuary suspended between two ages. Within its walls lived every breath of the coming world. Beyond its walls stretched the memory of everything that had been. Day after day, the ark drifted. The survivors could not see the water's full extent, but they could feel it, the vastness pressing against their vessel, the heaviness of judgment wrapped around their journey. They waited without knowing how long the silence would endure. They waited without knowing what remnants, if any, would greet them when the waters receded. Traditions from distant cultures mirror this sense of suspended time. They speak of a world washed clean, of mountains swallowed, of stars hidden behind curtains of storm. Some describe the flood as a cosmic renewal, a cycle of destruction and rebirth. Others preserve memories of divine sorrow, emphasizing the grief that accompanies necessary cleansing. In all these accounts, the flood stands not simply as an event, but as a threshold, a passage between the world that was and the world that would be. As the waters reached their fullest height, creation held its breath. No bird flew across the sky, no voice called from the land, no creature stirred within forests now submerged. The giants, whose shadows once stretched across entire valleys, were gone. The watchers, bound in their sorrow, looked upon a world transformed beyond recognition. Humanity, reduced in number, floated upon the ark like a single flame preserved in darkness. Yet even in this profound stillness, a quiet truth endured. The flood was not the end of creation. It was the end of corruption. It was the closing of a chapter marked by imbalance, a cleansing of wounds carried across generations. Beneath the silence lay the faint pulse of renewal, a world waiting to be shaped again by divine intention. But before renewal could begin, the silence deepened further still, wrapping the world in a calm that seemed endless. The long silence that followed the flood settled upon the earth like a second veil, deeper and more solemn than the first. The waters, having reached their appointed heights, began to rest. Their fierce rising gave way to stillness. Their roaring softened into a quiet expanse that, stretched from horizon to horizon, broken only by the gentle movement of waves beneath a sky slowly clearing its grief. The storm had spoken. Now the silence spoke more deeply. For many days the ark drifted across this boundless sea. Its wooden frame creaked beneath the shifting waters, its passengers listening not to the world they once knew, but to the quiet between each wave. No voice rose from the deep. No creature cried from the land. The giants, whose presence had once shaped entire regions, were gone. The watchers, bound in judgment, remained silent. Humanity, reduced to a single remnant, floated between memory and promise. Inside the ark, the sense of loss was not small. Though the world outside had been filled with violence and corruption, it had also been filled with life, fields, forests, rivers, communities, families, voices that now existed only in memory. Noah and his family carried those memories with them, even as they clung to the hope that the world would one day be renewed. The silence of the flood was not only the absence of sound, it was the passage between worlds. As the days unfolded, the waters began their slow retreat. The winds shifted. The fountains of the deep closed. The heavy clouds that had concealed the heavens drifted apart, revealing patches of light that had not been seen since the flood began. Yet the earth remained hidden beneath the waters, its mountains submerged, its valleys filled. The ark waited, held aloft by waves that marked the passing of time with gentle precision. In the ancient texts, this period is described with quiet reverence. The world beneath the floodwaters was not forgotten. It was being prepared, cleansed, restored. The Most High, whose sorrow had shaped the judgment, now watched with patience as creation slowly returned to balance. The flood had been an act of renewal, not annihilation. Through destruction, life was preserved. Through silence, a new beginning was formed. Eventually, the ark came to rest upon the slopes of distant mountains. The waters continued to withdraw, revealing the first outlines of a world washed clean. Peaks emerged like islands. Ridges traced their way through the receding sea. The land, though reshaped, remained steadfast beneath its new beginning. As the waters lowered further, Noah sent out a bird to search for signs of life. When the dove returned with an olive leaf, the moment carried meaning deeper than words, a symbol of peace returning to a world that had known long sorrow. In time, the earth dried, the ark opened, Noah and his family stepped out into a world transformed. The air carried the scent of renewed soil. The light held a clarity untouched by corruption. The silence that followed the flood was no longer heavy with endings. It was gentle, filled with possibility. It was the silence of mourning before the first footstep, the silence of a world waiting to be shaped again. Yet even as the new age began, the memory of the old one did not vanish. It lived within the stories passed down through generations, stories of giants whose footsteps shook the land, of watchers whose choices altered creation, of a world that lost its harmony and found it again through cleansing. These memories were not carried to rekindle fear. They were carried to preserve wisdom. Different traditions preserved these memories in their own ways. Some spoke of the flood as a cosmic cycle, an age ending so another could rise. Others emphasized the divine sorrow behind the judgment, reminding future generations that balance in creation is a gift easily lost when boundaries are crossed. Still others held tightly to the story of the ark, seeing in it a quiet declaration that mercy survives even within judgment. As these stories echoed across cultures and ages, they formed a shared remembrance. A world once overwhelmed by corruption had been renewed through water and silence. The giants, whose troubled existence embodied the fracture between heaven and earth, were no more. But their memory endured, not as tales of terror, but as reminders of the fragile balance that sustains creation. The silence after the flood eventually gave way to the sounds of life returning, wind through new leaves, the call of animals emerging from the ark, the footsteps of Noah's family upon fresh soil. But the deeper silence remained, woven into the story itself. It was the silence of reflection, the silence that follows cleansing, the silence through which the world learns to breathe again. When the waters of the great flood receded and the earth opened itself once more to the light of a renewed age, the world seemed cleansed of every shadow that had once strained it. The giants had fallen. The watchers were bound. The corruption that had filled the early world had been washed away. Yet memory, unlike stone or soil, is not easily carried off by waters. It lingers in the quiet places of creation, in the stories of families, in the echoes of landscapes shaped long ago. And across generations, whispers began to rise, whispers of remnants, beings or bloodlines that carried faint traces of the world that had vanished beneath the flood. In the writings of Deuteronomy and Samuel, shadows of this older age appear with careful restraint. These texts speak of people of unusual stature, warriors whose height and strength set them apart from the common measure of humankind. Names such as the Anakim, the Rephaim, and the descendants of Rapha emerge from the pages, not as central figures, but as reminders. Their presence suggests that the imprint of the pre-flood world had not fully disappeared. Though the giants of old were gone, something of their lineage, or something shaped by their lingering influence, seemed to endure at the edges of later history. These post-flood giants did not reach the vastness of their predecessors. They were not the towering beings whose steps shook mountains. They were smaller, bound more firmly to the earth, shaped by a world no longer able to sustain the scale of the first giants. Yet their presence was unmistakable. Their height, their strength, and the stories surrounding them bore the imprint of an older age, like faint footprints left in hardened clay. Regional myths echo these biblical hints. In distant lands, far from the regions described in Scripture, cultures preserve tales of tall warriors, ancient clans of unusual might, and beings who carried echoes of a world that no longer existed. Some spoke of small tribes descended from the mighty ones before, living in remote valleys or high beyond mountain passes. Others recounted encounters with solitary giants, reclusive figures who wandered the far edges of human settlement, appearing rarely and disappearing without explanation. These stories varied in detail but shared a single theme. The past had not vanished without leaving traces behind. The earth itself seemed to carry memories of the earlier age. Great stones positioned in ways beyond ordinary human strength, ancient structures whose builders remained unknown, and legends surrounding these places gave rise to whispered speculations. Some claimed these works were remnants of the giants' labor. Others believed they were shaped by those who came after, people who inherited a fraction of the strength once held by pre-flood beings. While the texts speak with caution, the traditions preserved through generations reveal a quiet certainty. Something of the ancient world lingered long after its destruction. The presence of these remnants stirred both fear and curiosity in the nations that encountered them. Some saw these beings as threats, shadows of the age of corruption returning to trouble the renewed world. Others saw them as living reminders of divine judgment and mercy, markers of history that called humanity to humility. The tension between these views shaped how later generations interacted with the giants who appeared after the flood. Yet the texts themselves do not dwell on terror. They speak instead with calm observation. They record these beings as part of the unfolding story, not as its central concern. Their presence is acknowledged, then passed over, as though the scriptures themselves wish to say, "Yes, the old world echoes here, but it is only an echo." The age shaped by watchers and giants had ended. The age shaped by covenant and human responsibility had begun. Still, even an echo can stir the heart. These remnants reminded humanity that history is not easily contained. The choices of earlier ages cast long shadows, reaching into the present in ways both subtle and profound. The giants who survived, or those who carried their likeness in later generations, stood as living proof that the flood had ended an era, but had not erased its memory. Their presence shaped the stories of nations. Their names entered the chronicles of kings. Their stature inspired awe. Their defeat brought confidence. Their existence whispered that the boundary between ancient times and present moments was thinner than it seemed. And so, across the far side of history, the remnants remained, not as rulers, not as threats to creation's order, but as reminders. Reminders of a world washed away, of choices made long before the present age, and of the truth that memory endures even when the world itself has been made new. As generations passed and human communities grew into nations, the faint traces of the ancient world continued to surface, never in forms as overwhelming as before, but in subtle manifestations that reminded later peoples of what had once walked the earth. These traces appeared not only in physical stature, but in the memories preserved through story, tradition, and the quiet places where history refused to fade. The scriptures speak with measured clarity about these remnants. Deuteronomy records the presence of the Anakim, a people noted for their height and formidable strength. Moses recounts how their stature struck fear into those who scouted the promised land. Yet the text also emphasizes that though they appeared mighty, they no longer bore the overwhelming dominance of the giants before the flood. Their presence was significant, but not insurmountable. They were echoes, strong, notable, but overshadowed by the memory of the beings who once towered over mountains. The book of Samuel introduces other figures whose size and might set them apart. Warriors descended from Rapha stood on battlefields with courage shaped not only by training, but perhaps by lineage that whispered of the distant past. Their height inspired awe and intimidation, yet their deaths at the hands of human warriors marked a turning point. These accounts show a world in which the ancient shadow still lingered, but the authority of that shadow had diminished. The remnants no longer shaped the destiny of nations. They appeared only at the edges, leaving traces rather than transformations. Regional traditions from beyond the scriptural landscape also tell of such remnants. In the hills of distant lands, stories were told of tall clans who kept to themselves, living apart from ordinary settlements. Travelers spoke in hushed tones of encountering towering figures at dusk, watchful, solitary, and silent. In coastal regions, legends emerged of stone structures built by hands too large for the current age, structures whose purpose had long been forgotten. In the far north or deep in remote forests, tales circulated of reclusive beings who appeared only in flashes of moonlight before vanishing again. Though these stories vary across cultures, they share a thread of continuity. Humanity sensed that the world still carried faint footprints of an earlier age. These remnants did not shape history. They did not overturn kingdoms or bend creation, but they reminded people that the past had been vast and that the world had borne beings whose presence far exceeded human measure. Some communities responded to these remnants with fear. They remembered the destruction associated with the ancient giants and viewed any sign of unusual strength or stature as a potential threat. Parents warned their children to avoid regions rumored to harbor such beings. Elders spoke of them as portents, warnings sent by history itself. Other communities responded with reverence. They saw these remnants not as dangers, but as living connections to a history older than memory. They believed that such beings carried knowledge passed down through generations long forgotten. Some even saw them as signs that the world, though renewed, still bore mysteries too deep for ordinary understanding. In both cases, the giants of later ages were not treated merely as individuals, but as symbols of the tension between what once was and what now existed. They represented the lingering presence of the early world, a world shaped by forces far greater than the everyday concerns of human life. Yet the scriptures maintain a tone of quiet steadiness. They do not dwell on these beings with fear or fascination. Instead, they treat them as part of the broader tapestry of human history, figures who appear briefly and then fade, leaving behind only a memory that points to a deeper truth. The ancient world had been cleansed by the flood, but the spiritual and physical echoes of that world continued to ripple across the generations. These remnants, whether few or many, were never central to the new covenantal age. They stood on the margins, not as threats to divine order but as witnesses to a story larger than their own lives. Their presence stirred human imagination, shaped regional myth, and preserved the sense that history's foundation rested upon more than what could be seen. Through them, humanity was reminded of humility. The world had once held beings far greater than any contemporary rulers or warriors. Strength alone did not determine the fate of nations. Mighty figures had risen before and fallen. Their downfall had come not through ordinary means, but through divine restoration. And so the remnants in later ages served as gentle markers of perspective. The past was vast, but the present belonged to a different order. In this way, the remnants of giants functioned as quiet echoes, not intrusions. They linked the renewed world to the one that had been washed away, carrying forward memory that no floodwaters could fully erase. Their existence whispered that history does not vanish. It retreats into silent corners, ready to reappear when needed to teach, remind, or caution. In the unfolding centuries, as nations rose and fell, and the memory of the flood slowly settled into legend, the echoes of the ancient world persisted, but always softly, always at the edges. These remnants did not move through history as central figures. They did not command the ages as their predecessors once had. Instead, they appeared like faint silhouettes behind a curtain of time, emerging briefly before fading back into obscurity. Yet their presence carried meaning far greater than their number or their deeds. The land itself seemed to remember them. Great stones arranged in patterns older than the surrounding civilization stood as markers of a strength no longer present in ordinary life. Roads cut through mountain passes whispered of hands that could move boulders with ease. Even the ruins buried beneath layers of soil spoke of construction, too ambitious for the strength available to later peoples. While scholars of later ages would debate their origins, the quiet traditions preserved among local communities traced these works back to the remnants, those who still carried the faint shadow of the giants of old. Scriptural references to the Rephaim and other giant clans appear with similar subtlety. They are mentioned not to elevate them, but to acknowledge their lingering presence. They remind the reader that the flood, though cleansing, did not wash away every memory of the earlier age. These passages hold a tone of calm certainty, presenting these beings not as threats to divine order, but as reminders of what once was. Their stature may have inspired fear, yet their defeat by human hands in later narratives revealed the diminished reach of their power. No longer did they shape the destiny of creation. They stood as shadows of a world long past. Regional myths across distant continents mirror this sense of fading echo. In some traditions, giants appear not as warriors but as quiet wanderers, solitary beings who watch from mountain ridges or stand motionless at the edge of forests, observed only by shepherds returning late from pasture. In others, they appear in dreams, speaking in symbols rather than words, as though they themselves were uncertain of their place in the new world. These stories portray the remnants not with grandeur, but with a quiet melancholy, as if they too understood that they belonged to a world that no longer existed. Humanity responded to these remnants with a mixture of awe and contemplation. Their presence stirred questions about the age before the flood, about the watchers, about the boundaries that had been crossed and restored. Their lives became points of reflection rather than sources of fear. When communities spoke of them, it was often with a tone that blended caution with reverence, acknowledging their difference while recognizing the lessons carried in their existence. Some elders told their children that these remnants were living reminders of the consequences of imbalance. Others believed they were symbols of mercy, showing that even in judgment, traces of the old world remained as cautionary witnesses. Still others saw them as a call to humility, proof that humanity should not place too much trust in strength alone. The giants of the past had been mighty beyond measure, yet their era had passed under the weight of divine sorrow and cleansing waters. These reflections shaped cultural memory in profound ways. They encouraged later generations to look beyond appearances and to seek meaning in the deeper patterns of history. The remnants, rare, scattered, and often misunderstood, became quiet teachers. They taught that greatness without balance brings strain, that strength without guidance brings disorder, that the world remembers transgression long after the transgressors are gone. Their existence carried the weight of a moral story, woven into the fibers of human tradition. In time, the remnants themselves faded. Their clans diminished. Their names slipped into obscurity. Their stories grew into legend. Yet their legacy endured, preserved not only in the texts of Deuteronomy, Samuel, and scattered myths, but in the collective memory of humanity. They were the final echoes of an age shaped by beings who reached beyond their appointed place, echoes allowed to linger so that future generations might remember the fragility of harmony. Thus, the world after the flood was not entirely untouched by the past. The age of giants had ended, but its shadows remained. They stood on the far side of history, neither dominating nor disappearing, serving as reminders that every age carries traces of the one before it. Through them, humanity glimpsed the vastness of its own story, a story shaped by divine intention, human choice, and the enduring memory of ages washed away but never fully forgotten. In the generations that followed the flood, when the earth had settled into its renewed quiet and the remnants of the ancient world lingered only in faint echoes, a new kind of guidance emerged, one not shaped by towering beings or cosmic descent, but by voices chosen to carry wisdom across the fragile span of human years. These were the prophets and sages, men who walked humbly upon the earth yet spoke with a clarity that did not belong to them alone. Their words bridged the distance between memory and instruction, between the lessons of the early ages and the lives of those who came after. The ancient world, with all its imbalance and sorrow, was not forgotten, but its stories, once heavy with fear and silence, were transformed by the prophets into teachings shaped by mercy. They spoke not to burden humanity with guilt, but to guide it with understanding. In their voices, the past became a lantern, illuminating the paths of the present. The scriptures describe these prophets as watchers in their own way, not heavenly beings bound to the firmament, but mortal guardians tasked with discerning the movements of the human heart. They observed the choices of their people, the rise and fall of nations, the quiet drift toward pride or humility. Their role was not to control, but to remind, not to dominate, but to call gently back to the ancient order set in the beginning. Their messages often returned to the themes that had shaped the earliest ages: the dangers of pride, the burden of forbidden knowledge, and the sacred boundaries that define creation. These warnings did not emerge from fear of giants or fallen watchers, for those beings had passed into memory. Instead, the warnings spoke to the same impulses that once opened the door to imbalance: the desire to rise beyond one's place, to grasp wisdom not meant to be held, to step across boundaries crafted by divine intention. The prophets understood that the ancient world had not been undone by physical strength alone. It had been undone by choices shaped by longing without wisdom, by desire without limits, by the yearning to grasp what was not given. And so they taught that the heart, not the giants, was the true battleground. The early tragedies served as reminders of how quickly balance can falter when a single boundary is crossed. In apocryphal writings, these themes appear with equal solemnity. The stories of watchers abandoning their appointed place, of forbidden teachings misused, and of giants born into imbalance become metaphors as much as memories. They are recounted not to dwell on destruction, but to reveal the quiet cost of pride. The prophets used these ancient accounts to shape their teachings, reminding their listeners that wisdom without righteousness brings harm, and power without humility brings sorrow. These warnings were never framed as threats. They were invitations, gentle calls to walk in alignment with the order woven into creation. The prophets spoke of obedience not as restriction, but as freedom. They showed that divine boundaries were not barriers meant to confine, but paths meant to preserve harmony. They reminded humanity that the Most High's laws were shaped by compassion, protecting the world from the same imbalance that once led to the flood. Memory itself became a sacred tool. Stories of the watchers and giants, of judgment and renewal, were preserved not merely as history, but as instruction. Each generation repeated them with reverence, knowing that memory carries the ability to guard against forgetfulness. Forgetting, the prophets warned, is the first step toward repeating the mistakes of the past. Among their teachings, there was always a thread of mercy. Even when they spoke of consequences, the tone was not one of anger but of sorrowful caution. The Most High, they taught, does not desire punishment. The divine desire is restoration, bringing creation back into the harmony it was shaped to hold. And so their warnings were acts of kindness, not condemnation. Their prophecies, though sometimes heavy, were offered to guide, not to terrify. As the prophets continued their work, memory deepened into something more than recollection. It became a living inheritance, carried from one age to the next. Parents told their children the stories of the early world. Elders recited the warnings of long-gone seers. Scribes preserved the sacred texts with meticulous care, ensuring that the lessons of the ancient world would never be lost to the tides of forgetting. In this way, prophecy, warning, and memory shaped the destiny of the renewed world. The giants had passed, the watchers had fallen, but their stories remained, transformed into wisdom, softened by mercy, and offered as guidance to generations who would never witness their shadows, yet would learn from the light that followed them. As time unfolded and generations took their place upon the renewed earth, the prophets continued to speak, giving shape to the ancient lessons carry. Through memory, their voices rose in quiet places, on mountainsides, in deserts, beside rivers where travelers paused to rest. They spoke with a solemn cadence, not to stir fear, but to steady the heart. Their role was not to retell the ancient tragedies in full, but to reveal the wisdom woven within them. The early stories of the Watchers and the giants lingered in the background of their teachings like distant thunder, remembered long after the storm has passed. The prophets did not dwell on the might of those beings, nor did they recount their downfall for spectacle. Instead, they pointed to the deeper currents beneath those events, the pride that opened forbidden doors, the misuse of knowledge meant for healing, the disregard for boundaries set to preserve harmony. These truths, they said, belong not only to the past but to every age. The ancient tragedies became mirrors held gently before humanity. In the prophets' words, one could see that the earth before the flood had not been undone by strength alone, but by hearts that drifted from humility. The Watchers, in their longing, had sought what was not given. The giants, in their troubled nature, had magnified the world's imbalance. Humanity, following the currents of its own desires, had abandoned the paths of righteousness. These stories were no longer warnings about beings of great stature, but about the human spirit itself, its capacity for both harmony and ruin. Scriptures preserve these prophetic reflections with quiet reverence. Isaiah speaks of the downfall of the proud as a disruption of divine order. Jeremiah warns of those who trust in their own wisdom rather than the guidance of the Most High. The psalmists write of the fragility of human strength and the necessity of walking in humility. Though these writings do not always mention the pre-flood world directly, their themes echo its lessons. Pride leads to imbalance, and imbalance leads to sorrow. Apocryphal texts expand this perspective. They speak of wisdom offered from above, paired with the warning that seeking knowledge without reverence leads to harm. They describe the boundaries set between heaven and earth, urging readers to honor them. They speak of sacred order as a gift, one that shelters creation from the very forces that once strained it. These writings, though often kept on the margins of canon, preserved insights that broadened the prophetic message. The ancient world had stumbled because its inhabitants forgot the purpose of their place. Sages, too, played their part. Unlike prophets whose voices carried divine urgency, the sages taught with quiet patience. They gathered disciples, wrote sayings, and reflected on the rhythms of creation. They observed nature, human behavior, and the subtle patterns of life. Their wisdom literature often echoed truths older than themselves, truths found in the stories of the early ages. They spoke of humility as a safeguard, patience as a path of peace, and reverence as the foundation of understanding. Though their teachings rarely addressed the giants or Watchers by name, their counsel flowed from the same well of remembrance. Through both prophets and sages, memory transformed into instruction. The ancient tales were not preserved to bind future generations to the weight of sorrow, but to free them from repeating it. The warnings of these voices carried a tone of compassion. They urged their listeners to consider the fragility of order and the ease with which boundaries can be crossed. They reminded humanity that creation thrives when each realm honors its place. They whispered that wisdom without humility becomes dangerous, just as power without restraint disturbs the balance of the world. These teachings were not merely spoken, they were woven into the community's life. Festivals recounted the mercy shown after the flood. Songs preserved the sorrow of ages long past. Customs honored the boundaries the Watchers once abandoned. Even the structure of daily living, prayer, work, rest, became a reflection of the harmony creation was meant to hold. In this way, memory shaped not only belief but practice. The ancient lessons became part of the rhythm of existence. Through this long process, the prophets ensured that the early world story would be carried forward without distortion. They guarded it from becoming rumor, myth, or fear. They framed it as wisdom, an inheritance meant to guide, not to haunt. Their warnings, though solemn, were always paired with a message of mercy. The Most High does not abandon creation. Even when judgment comes, it comes with the purpose of healing. Even when boundaries are crossed, restoration is offered. The prophets lived as witnesses to this truth, reminding humanity that divine instruction is always shaped by compassion. In their voices, the ancient world continued to speak, softly, steadily, and with enduring purpose. As memory deepened and the teachings of prophets and sages spread across generations, the ancient world found a place within the spiritual imagination of humanity, not as a realm of fear, but as a reservoir of wisdom. The stories of the Watchers, the giants, and the flood did not fade into distant myth. They remained as living reminders woven into the fabric of sacred thought, shaping the way people understood themselves, their world, and the boundaries set by the Most High. In this later era, the role of the prophets became increasingly clear. They were custodians of sacred memory. They guarded the lessons of the early ages, ensuring that the warnings preserved in ancient texts would not be lost beneath the distractions of daily life. Their voices, though often met with resistance, carried the weight of history. They spoke so that humanity would not forget the gentle order set at creation, nor the sorrow that followed when that order was neglected. One of their central messages concerned pride. The prophets knew that pride was the quiet force that had once opened the door to imbalance, the longing of the Watchers, the ambitions of humanity before the flood. Pride led beings to step beyond their appointed place, to reach for what was not given, to imagine themselves above wisdom's guidance. Thus, the prophets returned again and again to this theme, speaking not with condemnation, but with a sober kindness. They urged humility, not as a denial of strength, but as a foundation for harmony. They taught that humility preserves what pride destroys, peace within the heart, balance within the world. They also addressed the lure of forbidden knowledge. The ancient texts speak of teachings the Watchers passed to humanity, skills and insights that without righteousness became sources of harm. The prophets did not deny the value of knowledge, nor did they forbid its pursuit. Instead, they taught that knowledge must always be paired with reverence. Wisdom, they said, is knowledge in its rightful place. Without reverence, knowledge becomes ambition. With reverence, it becomes light. These themes were not confined to prophecy alone. They were reflected in the Psalms, where the poets spoke of walking in the ways of the Most High as the path to peace. They appeared in the sayings of the sages, who urged their students to listen before speaking, to seek understanding before acting, to honor the rhythm of creation. Even in narratives of kings and warriors, the texts preserved gentle reminders that strength is safest when guided by humility. Through these connected teachings, memory transformed into something living and active. The early world, its harmony and its downfall, became a foundation for instruction, shaping the moral imagination of future generations. Children grew up hearing stories of the flood not only as a tale of judgment, but as a story of renewal. They learned that boundaries were not barriers but gifts. They came to understand that the Most High acts not from wrath, but from a sorrowful mercy aimed at restoring balance. This understanding shaped the way communities related to one another as well. The prophets taught that the same imbalance which once strained creation could arise again among people if they allowed pride, violence, and misuse of knowledge to guide their steps. They urged righteousness and justice, not as lofty ideals, but as safeguards against the kinds of corruption that once filled the earth. Memory became a guide, showing that the lessons of the ancient world were eternally relevant. for the human heart had changed little across the ages. In time, the ancient accounts became symbols within the larger narrative of sacred history. The Watchers represented the danger of crossing boundaries set for the sake of harmony. The giants symbolized the burden of imbalance. The flood illustrated the sorrow of necessary restoration. Each story offered a lesson, and each lesson carried a thread of mercy. For even in judgment the Most High preserved life. Even in cleansing a remnant was saved. Even in sorrow hope was planted. The prophets carried these truths like torches through darkened valleys, offering light to guide the weary. They reminded humanity that remembering the past is an act of preservation, not of fear, but of wisdom. Thus the ancient world endured in sacred memory, not as a tale of terror but as a quiet teacher. Its warnings were gentle, its lessons enduring, its messages shaped by compassion. And through the voices of prophets and sages, the early ages continued to speak across time, whispering the same truth to every generation. That harmony is a gift, that boundaries protect, and that remembering is itself an act of mercy. Across the long span of human history, countless writings have vanished, scrolls worn away by wind, tablets broken beneath the weight of time, memories lost in the shifting tides of nations. Yet among the fragments that endured, certain accounts of the ancient world remained. They survived exile, suppression, translation, and the silent erosion of centuries. They lived on in hidden caves, in the margins of sacred manuscripts, in the whispered traditions of wandering families. Their endurance was not a matter of chance. It was shaped by a quiet, persistent purpose that flowed beneath the surface of human memory. These texts, speaking of watchers who descended, of giants born into imbalance, of the flood that cleansed the world, held a weight that later generations could not release. They carried lessons older than history itself. They bore witness to the fragility of harmony, to the cost of crossing divine boundaries, and to the mercy that restores what corruption has undone. For this reason, communities across distant lands chose to preserve them, even when doing so demanded secrecy or sacrifice. Some hid them in jars deep within desert caves, trusting that silence and sand would guard their words through ages of turmoil. Others carried them across mountains during exile, wrapped tightly with their most precious possessions. Scribes copied them by lamplight, shaping each stroke with reverent care. Elders recited them beside night fires so that even when written texts were lost, the stories would continue through memory. These efforts reveal not a fascination with the giants themselves, but a profound understanding of the truths woven into their stories. For the ancient world had taught a lesson that reached far beyond its own age. That creation stands upon delicate boundaries, and when those boundaries are broken, the cost spreads through every realm. The Watchers had crossed a line set for the sake of order. The giants, born from their transgression, experienced the burdens that follow imbalance. Humanity, drawn toward the misuse of knowledge, tasted the consequences of abandoning righteousness. These truths, preserved in the surviving texts, became reflections of the human condition, reminders of the dangers that arise when pride overtakes humility. The communities that guarded these writings understood this. They recognized that the value of these texts did not rest in the marvel of ancient beings, but in the moral and spiritual clarity they offered. Through them, generations learned that divine order is not arbitrary. It is a gift that protects creation. They learned that rebellion against that order carries a weight that endures long after the initial act, and they learned that even when the world breaks, restoration is possible through divine mercy. The survival of these texts reveals another truth. Memory itself is sacred. When nations fell and empires dissolved, when families scattered beneath the pressures of war or famine, these stories remained a thread of continuity. They connected distant generations to the earliest ages, allowing each new listener to understand their place within a much larger story. They reminded the weary that others had faced turmoil before them, and that divine guidance had not abandoned creation then or now. In this way, the endurance of these writings became a quiet testimony to the resilience of sacred memory. They survived because they were needed, not only to preserve history, but to shape wisdom. They endured because they spoke to the depths of the human heart, and they remained because the Most High allowed truth to find its way through the fractures of time. Thus, the survival of these ancient accounts was not merely coincidence. It was a form of mercy, a gentle insistence that the lessons of the early world should not be forgotten, that the echoes of those ages would continue to guide the living toward humility, obedience, and hope. As centuries passed and languages rose and faded, the survival of these ancient accounts became even more remarkable. They endured transitions that would have erased lesser stories, migrations, wars, the collapse of kingdoms, the shifting of borders, and the scattering of communities across vast landscapes. Yet through all this movement, the writings concerning the Watchers and the Giants continued to appear, resurfacing in unexpected regions, carried by people who believed that memory was a sacred trust. Some of these texts traveled through translation, crossing from one culture to another. With each new language, their form shifted slightly, yet their core remained intact. Their preservation was not accidental. Scribes who encountered them recognized the gravity of their message. They saw in these ancient stories reflections of their own world, its temptations, its fragility, its struggles with pride and disorder. And so they copied the texts again and again, ensuring that the wisdom of the early ages would not be lost in the movement of time. In the libraries of ancient cities, where scrolls were often destroyed through neglect or conquest, certain writings were singled out for preservation. Their themes of divine order and the consequences of rebellion resonated with scholars who sought to understand the deeper patterns of history. Even when empires fell, fragments survived, sometimes only a single tablet, a single line of script, or a single retold story. Yet even these pieces carried enough weight to keep the memory alive. The endurance of these accounts is also reflected in traditions far from the lands where they first arose. Stories of great beings, of heavenly descent, of floods that reshaped the world appear in countless cultures, each version distinct, yet unmistakably connected to the early echoes found in Genesis, Enoch, and other ancient writings. This widespread resonance suggests that humanity sensed a shared truth buried within these stories, a truth too profound to belong to any one people or language. It was as though the lessons of the early world had been etched indirectly into the collective memory of humankind. Communities preserved these texts not simply because they were old, but because they were meaningful. They provided a framework for understanding the tension between obedience and pride, between divine intention and human desire. They reminded listeners that the boundaries set at creation were not arbitrary but compassionate, and they revealed that the consequences of violating those boundaries could ripple across generations, shaping the destiny of the world. At the heart of this preservation lies a quiet spiritual value. These writings did not survive because they offered spectacle, but because they offered perspective. They helped later generations grasp the vastness of the divine story and their small yet significant place within it. They reminded people that the early ages had seen both tragedy and mercy, and that the same divine compassion that restored the world after the flood continued to guide humanity still. Apocryphal communities guarded these stories with particular care. Some believed that the lessons contained within them were too important to leave vulnerable to political shifts or religious disputes. They copied them into hidden collections, preserved them in caves, or wove them into oral traditions that endured even when written scrolls were lost. Their devotion ensured that the stories of the Watchers and the Giants remained accessible long after the civilizations that first recorded them had vanished. These texts also survived because they offered hope. The early world, though shattered by rebellion, had been renewed. Order had been restored. A remnant had been preserved. And in this preservation lay a message for all ages, that divine mercy persists even when creation falters. The giants, the watchers, the flood, each element of the ancient narrative carried a thread of redemption, a reminder that the Most High does not abandon the world even when judgment is necessary. Thus, the survival of these writings became a testament to endurance, not only the endurance of parchment and clay, but the endurance of wisdom itself. Truth, however fragile its vessel, finds ways to remain. The stories endured because they carried light, and communities, sensing this light, protected it with reverence. In their resilience, these ancient texts teach a quiet lesson. That memory preserved with humility becomes instruction, and instruction preserved with care becomes mercy offered to future generations. Across the quiet stretch of generations, the preservation of these ancient writings became more than an act of memory. It became an act of devotion. The stories of the Watchers and the giants, the rise of corruption, the cleansing of the flood, and the renewal that followed were not merely historical remnants. They were lanterns held against the oncoming dusk of forgetting. Their survival shaped the spiritual imagination of countless communities, becoming part of the foundation upon which later faith, wisdom, and reflection were built. The endurance of these texts reveals something profound about the nature of truth. Truth, once spoken, seeks continuity. It rests in human hearts, passes between generations, settles into the soil of memory, and finds vessels, written or spoken, through which it may remain. Even when rulers attempted to silence these accounts, even when scribes faced danger for preserving them, even when wars scattered the communities that cherished them, the stories continued. They survived not because they were loud, but because they were necessary. At the heart of their survival lies the spiritual value ancient communities discovered within them. They saw in these stories the outline of divine order, a reminder that creation had been shaped with intention, that boundaries had been established for the sake of harmony, and that disregarding those boundaries had consequences that echoed across realms. The stories became tools for reflection, teaching that wisdom is found not only in what is gained, but in understanding what must be respected. They also revealed the cost of rebellion, the Watchers' choice to cross their appointed boundary, the giants' troubled existence, and the spread of corruption illustrated a truth woven through all ages. That desire without restraint leads to imbalance. Communities preserved these accounts because they recognized their relevance. The dangers faced by the early world were not confined to the past. Pride, ambition, and the misuse of knowledge remain perennial temptations. Through these ancient tales, generations learned the importance of humility and obedience, virtues that anchor creation's harmony. Yet the writings endured not through warning alone, but through hope. The flood, though a cleansing judgment, carried within it a promise of restoration. A remnant was saved. Life continued. Renewal followed. These truths reassured later generations that the Most High does not abandon creation, even when correction is required. The stories of the early ages, preserved through so many hardships, became beacons of hope in times of turmoil. They reminded listeners that mercy is always near, that sorrow can lead to renewal, and that divine compassion extends beyond human understanding. In many communities, these stories were preserved in sacred gatherings. Elders recited them during festivals of remembrance. Scribes taught them to apprentices who would carry the work forward. Travelers shared them across borders, shaping a quiet network of memory that crossed cultures and continents. Even when languages shifted, the heart of the stories remained. Even when texts were translated, their warning and their promise endured. Over time, the survival of these writings became part of their message. Their endurance testified to their importance. If stories written on fragile scrolls could withstand exile, war, and the erosion of centuries, then perhaps the truths within them were indeed divinely sustained. Communities saw in this survival a reflection of the very theme the writings carried, that what is meant to endure will endure, even when the world around it changes. These texts continue to guide reflection not only due to their content, but because of their journey. They are records of human faithfulness, faithfulness to memory, to wisdom, and to the desire to offer future generations the tools needed to walk in harmony. Their survival is a testament to humanity's longing for meaning, for order, and for connection with the divine story that stretches across time. As this chapter draws toward its quiet close, the deeper meaning of their endurance becomes clear. These stories survived because they were meant to. They were preserved because they carry truths that the world must not forget. They remind each generation that the early ages, though distant, still speak. Their warnings guide, their hope comforts, their memory endures. Through exile, through silence, through the breaking of civilizations and the healing that followed, the stories of the Watchers and Giants remained. In their survival, they prepared the way for understanding, for humility, and for the peace that comes from recognizing the purpose woven into creation. When the long journey of the ancient world draws near its quiet conclusion, the stories that once stirred awe begin to settle into a softer form. Their edges smooth, their voices dim. The weight they carried becomes gentler, resting not as a burden but as a quiet reminder of what creation has passed through. The Watchers, the Giants, the Flood, the Prophets, the fragments of memory, all these elements that once shaped the early ages now gather like distant echoes fading into the calm of evening. In this final reflection, the giants stand not as figures of fear, but as symbols of a world vast in its beginning and fragile in its unfolding. Their towering forms, once capable of shaking the ground beneath them, have become shadows softened by time. They reveal how easily creation can be strained when harmony is neglected, and how even beings of great strength can carry sorrow when born outside divine intention. Their presence in memory reminds humanity that power alone cannot guide a world. Only wisdom can. The Watchers, too, appear differently in this quiet hour. Their descent, once a moment of cosmic rupture, now reflects the delicate balance that holds creation together. They remind later generations of the importance of place, purpose, and humility. Their longing, their choice, and the sorrow that followed have become lessons that whisper rather than thunder. Through them, the ancient world teaches that boundaries exist not to confine, but to preserve the peace woven into the fabric of existence. The flood, with its rising waters and long silence, no longer stands as an image of destruction. It becomes instead an image of mercy, a cleansing that allowed the world to breathe again, a pause that made room for renewal. The waters that once covered the earth now rest in memory as a reminder that judgment, when it comes from the Most High, is shaped by sorrow and guided by compassion. Renewal remains the quiet center of that story, the gentle truth that creation, though wounded, can begin again. Through every chapter of the ancient narrative flows the same thread: memory as a gift, memory that warns, memory that guides, memory that comforts. It is through memory that the lessons of the early world remain alive, not as fear but as wisdom, not as noise but as stillness. And now, in this final turning of the tale, those memories settle like dusk upon the landscape of the mind. They no longer call for analysis, for searching, or for fear. They call only for rest. They invite the listener to sit at the edge of these ancient echoes and allow them to fade naturally into the quiet from which they came. For the world is still watched, still guided, still held beneath the gaze of the one who shaped it. The early stories do not exist to disturb the heart but to steady it, to remind it that creation, no matter how troubled its past, is never abandoned. The echoes fade, but the presence that guided the ages remains. And so the narrative moves toward stillness, toward calm, toward a peace deeper than silence. As the ancient echoes soften further, they begin to settle into the deeper layers of remembrance, those quiet places where story becomes reflection and reflection becomes understanding. The early world, once marked by great upheaval, now appears as a distant shore viewed across the calm of a long sea. Its details grow gentle. Its lessons grow clear. What once towered now humbles. What once frightened now instructs. The giants, the watchers, the flood, and the voices of prophets no longer stand as separate events, but as parts of a single movement within creation's long story. In this softened light, the giants become symbols rather than figures, representations of imbalance, of strength without harmony, of the fragility that lies beneath every display of might. Their stories remind the world that even the greatest beings cannot escape the consequences of disorder. Yet they also reveal another truth, that the Most High, in cleansing the earth, did not act with hatred, but with sorrow for what had become necessary. The giants, for all their troubled origins, are remembered with a quiet compassion in this final reflection. They are no longer beings to fear, but reminders of how creation can lose its balance when boundaries are set aside. The watchers, too, become symbols of longing, of the desire to reach beyond one's appointed place, of the ache that leads even heavenly beings toward choices they were never meant to make. Their story, preserved across centuries, speaks to every generation that wrestles with desire and restraint. In the end, their memory invites humility, a recognition that wisdom is not found in grasping what is forbidden, but in honoring the order that sustains all things. The flood, once overwhelming in its scale and sorrow, now becomes a gentle turning point within memory. Its waters, though fierce in their rising, carried with them the renewal the world needed. They washed away not life itself, but the sea, eruption that had made creation groan. In the quiet after the flood, a truth remains. Even in judgment, mercy stands close. Even in loss, hope waits beneath the surface. The flood becomes not an ending, but a cleansing breath that allowed the world to continue. The prophets who later preserved these truths become part of this final echo as well. Through their words, the ancient stories found new life, shaped not by fear, but by insight. They taught that remembering the early ages was a means of walking wisely in the present. Their voices became lanterns held against the shadows of pride, reminding every generation that the world is fragile and that divine boundaries are gifts meant to protect its harmony. As all these strands come together, the narrative begins to soften into stillness. The purpose of these stories has never been noise or spectacle. Their purpose is quiet guidance. Their survival through time is itself a message. What endures is what is needed. What persists is what protects. The giants remain in memory not for their size, but for the lesson their existence carried. The watchers remain not for their fall, but for the wisdom in their sorrow. The flood remains not for its destruction, but for its renewal. In this way, the ancient stories lead the heart gently toward rest. They remind it that creation, though vast and mysterious, is held within a divine order that cannot be broken without consequence, yet cannot be shattered without mercy. This balance, firm yet compassionate, becomes the foundation upon which peace is found. Now, as the echoes fade even further, only their meaning remains. They settle into the quiet with the softness of distant waves reaching a shore long after the storm has passed, and the heart, hearing these softened echoes, feels no fear, only calm, only understanding, only the slow unfolding of peace. As the final echoes of the ancient world drift into silence, the story returns to the stillness from which it first emerged. The great themes memory, judgment, mercy, renewal come to rest gently, like dust settling after a long and wandering journey. Nothing strains the heart now. Nothing calls for urgency. The world stands quiet beneath the steady gaze of the one who shaped it, and the early ages become a soft shadow lying just beyond the horizon of thought. In this closing reflection, the giants are remembered not for their might, but for the lesson carried in their existence. They reveal how easily the balance of creation can be strained when boundaries are crossed. They remind the world that strength without order becomes burden, that desire without humility opens paths that lead to sorrow. Yet they are remembered with compassion. Their origins were troubled, their lives marked by imbalance they did not choose. In the end, they stand as gentle symbols of a world, learning the cost of stepping beyond what was given. The Watchers likewise settle into their place within the quiet. Their descent once shook the boundary between heaven and earth, yet now their memory carries a softened meaning. They remind humanity of the importance of honoring one's purpose, of recognizing the grace found in staying within the place shaped by divine wisdom. Their story is no longer a tale of fear, but a whisper of caution wrapped in mercy, a reminder that even heavenly beings must guard their hearts. The flood, too, finds its peaceful rest within memory. Its waters no longer roar. They no longer rise. They remain only as a symbol of cleansing, a divine breath that restored harmony to a world overwhelmed by imbalance. Judgment in this quiet light is seen not as anger, but as sorrowful necessity, an act that allowed creation to begin again. And the stillness that followed the flood becomes an emblem of renewal, a promise that even when the world breaks, it can be healed. The prophets and sages, guardians of sacred memory, also take their place in this final pattern. Through them, the lessons of the early ages were preserved, softened, and offered to the generations that followed. Their voices ensured that fear would not govern the story, that wisdom would. They turned ancient warning into gentle counsel, ancient sorrow into quiet guidance. Through their care, the earliest stories were woven into the hearts of later ages, not as burdens but as lights. And now, as all these strands come together for the final time, the story releases its hold. It does not vanish, it simply becomes part of the stillness. The early world, its vastness, its wonders, its sorrows, rests beneath the calm of memory. Its echoes grow faint, yet they remain, carried forward in the quiet truths they revealed. Creation continues, watched and guided, held within the mercy that shaped it from the beginning. In this softened silence, the heart finds peace. The giants, the watchers, the flood, all have taken their rightful place in the tapestry of sacred history. Their stories no longer stir fear or curiosity. They invite rest. They remind the listener that the world, though touched by imbalance, is anchored in a deeper harmony. That even when boundaries are crossed, restoration is possible. That divine compassion flows through every age, even those marked by sorrow. And so the tale withdraws, leaving behind a sense of calm. The ancient echoes fade, but the truths they carried remain like gentle footprints in the sand, small, quiet marks guiding the mind toward peace. The rest beyond the story is not empty, it is full of quiet assurance. The world is held. The journey is complete. The night deepens, carrying the listener into stillness.